The sound of tearing fabric cut through the grand hall like a scream no one was ready to hear. It echoed off the marble pillars, bounced across the crystal chandeliers, and landed directly on the heart of one girl standing in the center of it all. One girl who had dared to dream that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. Her name was Alina. And in the span of 3 heartbeats, everything she had worked for, prayed for, bled for, was being ripped apart right before her eyes. The Luna selection was supposed to be the most sacred night in the kingdom. A night when unmated she-wolves from every pack across the realm gathered in the Alpha King's palace, dressed in their finest gowns, carrying the hopes of their bloodlines on their trembling shoulders. It was a night of elegance, of tradition, of destiny finding its chosen vessel. But for Alina, it had just become a nightmare. She could feel the cold air hitting her bare skin now, creeping through the jagged tears in what used to be the most beautiful dress she had ever owned. Her stepsisters, Cassandra and Delilah, stood before her with smiles so cruel they could have been carved from ice itself. Their perfectly manicured claws were still extended, shreds of pale blue fabric dangling from their fingertips like trophies of war. The great hall had gone deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on Alina. Every whisper had died in throats that now held nothing but shock, or worse, amusement. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her like stones, each one heavier than the last. Hundreds of wolves from the most powerful packs in the realm stood frozen, watching her humiliation unfold as though it were entertainment crafted just for them. And perhaps, to some of them, it was. Alina's hands moved instinctively to cover herself, to hold together the tattered remnants of silk and lace that now hung from her body like broken wings. The dress had been her mother's. The only thing she had left of a woman who had died whispering Alina's name, promising her that one day she would rise above the ashes of her suffering and become something no one could ever tear down. But here she was, being torn down in front of the entire kingdom. Her stepmother, Vivian, stood several feet behind Cassandra and Delilah, her expression unreadable, her arms folded across her chest. She made no move to stop her daughters. She made no move to help. She simply watched, the same way she had watched for years as Alina was beaten, starved, locked in cellars, and treated like a stain on the family name rather than the rightful daughter of the former beta of the Silver Ridge Pack. Alina's father had been a great man once. Respected. Honored. He had served the previous Alpha King with unwavering loyalty until his dying breath. But when he was gone, Vivian had wasted no time in rewriting history. She had married into the Pack's bloodline through manipulation and deceit, and once she held the reins of power, she had made it her personal mission to erase every trace of Alina's mother from existence, including Alina herself. The years of abuse had taught Alina many things. How to move through a house without making a sound. How to read the shift in someone's eyes before their hand came flying toward her face. How to bury her pain so deep that even her own wolf could barely reach it anymore. She had learned to survive in the shadows, to make herself small, to disappear. But tonight, she had dared to step into the light. Tonight, she had allowed herself to hope. And now that hope was unraveling along with the only dress she had ever loved. The whispers started again, crawling through the crowd like serpents seeking warmth. Alina could catch fragments of them, each word slicing deeper than the last. Pathetic. Embarrassing. Why would anyone even let her in? Look at her. She does not belong here. She never did. Cassandra stepped closer, her voice dripping with venom that she did not even bother to hide. Her lips moved with deliberate cruelty, her words loud enough for the entire hall to hear. She made a declaration that Alina would never forget. A declaration that this was what happened to strays who forgot their place. A proclamation that no one in this room, least of all the Alpha King, would ever choose someone as broken, as worthless as Alina. Delilah laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that bounced off the high ceilings and echoed through Alina's skull like a death knell. Others in the crowd joined in, their laughter spreading like wildfire, consuming any remaining shred of dignity Alina had left. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to turn around and flee through the massive oak doors she had entered through just an hour ago. To disappear into the cold night air outside and never look back. To find some dark corner of the kingdom where no one would ever find her, where she could let her wolf take over and run until her legs gave out and her heart finally stopped breaking. But her feet would not move. It was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, pulling her down, trapping her in this moment of absolute devastation. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps that did nothing to fill her starving lungs. The edges of her vision were beginning to blur with tears she refused to let fall. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Not when crying was exactly what they wanted. But the pain was overwhelming. It rose up from somewhere deep in her chest, a tidal wave of grief and shame and fury that threatened to drown her where she stood. She could feel her wolf stirring beneath the surface, agitated, restless, clawing at the walls of the mental cage Alina had built around her years ago. That wolf had always been different. Alina had known it from the moment of her first shift, when she was just 13 years old and the world as she knew it had shattered completely. Most wolves shifted for the first time under the light of a full moon, surrounded by pack members who would guide them through the transformation, who would celebrate their awakening and welcome them into the fold of adulthood. Alina's first shift had happened in the middle of a thunderstorm. She had been alone in the cellar where Vivian had locked her as punishment for some imagined offense, hungry and shivering in the dark, when the first bolt of lightning had struck the ground outside. The pain had come without warning, ripping through her body like fire and ice colliding. Her bones had cracked and reformed. Her skin had split and healed. Her screams had turned to howls that no one came to answer. And when the transformation was complete, she had not been a wolf like any other. Her fur had been pure white, as pale as fresh snow under a winter moon. But threaded through that white were streaks of something else, something that glowed with a faint silver luminescence that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Her eyes, when she had finally caught her reflection in a shard of broken glass, had been a shade of violet that should not have existed in nature. She had been terrified. And she had been right to be. Because when Vivian had discovered what Alina had become, she had not celebrated. She had not welcomed. She had looked at Alina's wolf form with an expression that could only be described as pure, unadulterated horror, and then she had spent the next 5 years making sure that no one, especially not Alina herself, ever saw that wolf again. The silver in her fur was a curse, Vivian had declared. A mark of something ancient and dangerous. Something that did not belong in the modern packs. Something that needed to be suppressed, controlled, contained. And if Alina ever dared to shift again, if she ever let that monstrous creature out of its cage, Vivian would personally make sure that she regretted it for the rest of her very short life. So Alina had learned to keep her wolf locked away. She had learned to ignore the howling inside her own mind, the desperate pleas of a creature that only wanted to be free. She had learned to pretend that she was nothing more than an ordinary she-wolf with no power, no purpose, and no future. But tonight, standing in the ruins of her mother's dress, surrounded by wolves who saw her as nothing more than entertainment, she could feel that cage beginning to crack. The silver light was stirring inside her. It pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat, warm and electric and utterly terrifying. It wanted out. It wanted to burst through her carefully constructed walls and show every single wolf in this room exactly what she was capable of. It wanted to burn away the laughter and the whispers and the cruel, cutting stares. It wanted vengeance. But Alina was not ready for that. She did not know what she was. She did not know what that silver light meant or why it lived inside her. All she knew was that it was dangerous, and that if she let it out now, in front of the entire kingdom, she would never be safe again. So she pushed it down. She took a deep breath, forcing the trembling in her hands to still, forcing the tears in her eyes to retreat, forcing the wild, primal energy inside her to return to its cage where it belonged. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not let Cassandra and Delilah and Vivian win. Not completely. Not yet. But even as she steadied herself, even as she lifted her chin and prepared to face her humiliation with whatever dignity she had left, she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. The representatives from the Mountain Claw Pack, all broad shoulders and suspicious eyes. The delegates from the Crimson Moon Territory, their silk robes rustling as they whispered among themselves. The warriors from the Shadowvale Forest, standing like statues along the walls, their expressions carved from stone. And at the far end of the great hall, raised upon a dais that gleamed with moonlight streaming through the towering windows above, sat the throne of the Alpha King. But the throne was empty. Alina had noticed it when she first entered the hall, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and foolish, fragile hope. The Luna selection was meant to be presided over by the Alpha King himself, the ruler of all the packs, the most powerful wolf in the entire realm. But no one had seen him yet. No one knew when he would arrive, or if he would arrive at all. Rumors had swirled through the crowd all evening. Some said the Alpha King was delayed by urgent matters of state. Others whispered that he had no interest in choosing a Luna, that he viewed the entire selection as a tedious formality he was forced to endure. A few bold voices even suggested that he was already here, hidden among the guests, watching and waiting to see which candidates were worthy of his attention. Alina had not believed that last rumor. Why would the Alpha King hide among commoners when he could sit upon his throne and watch them all scramble for his favor like ants before a god? But now, standing alone in her shredded dress, she found herself wishing desperately that the rumor was false. That he was not here. That he had not seen this moment of complete and utter destruction. Because if the Alpha King had witnessed what just happened, if he had seen her stepsisters tear her dress apart while the entire hall laughed, then her humiliation was not just personal. It was political. It was permanent. It would follow her for the rest of her life. A cold gust of wind swept through the hall, and Alina shivered. The massive windows along the eastern wall had been opened to let in the light of the full moon, a tradition meant to honor the goddess who had first blessed their kind with the ability to shift. But the wind that came through now carried something else with it. The scent of rain. The rumble of distant thunder. A storm was brewing on the horizon, dark clouds gathering like wolves circling their prey. How fitting, Alina thought bitterly. Even the sky knew what was happening here tonight. The laughter around her was beginning to fade, replaced by whispers that had shifted in tone. Something was changing in the atmosphere of the hall. The wolves who had been mocking her moments ago were now looking past her, their expressions shifting from amusement to something else. Curiosity, confusion, and in some cases, barely concealed fear. Alina did not understand what was happening at first. She was too focused on keeping herself upright, on holding the pieces of her dress together, on breathing through the tightness in her chest. But then she noticed that Cassandra's smile had frozen on her face. Delilah's laughter had caught in her throat. Vivian's carefully composed expression had cracked, revealing something beneath that looked almost like panic. They were all looking at something behind Alina. Someone. The air in the great hall grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of Alina's neck stand on end. Every wolf in the room could feel it. That undeniable pressure that came from being in the presence of an alpha. Not just any alpha, but one whose power dwarfed anything any of them had ever experienced before. The footsteps that echoed through the sudden silence were slow and deliberate. Each one seemed to shake the very foundations of the marble floor beneath Alina's feet. Each one brought with it a wave of power so intense that some of the younger wolves in the crowd actually whimpered and lowered their eyes in automatic submission. This was not the approach of a common pack leader. This was not even the approach of a regional alpha. This was something else entirely. This was the approach of a king. Alina wanted to turn around. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to look, to see who was coming, to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. But she could not move. Her body had frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the presence washing over her. And then she felt it. Warmth. It settled over her shoulders like a whisper, soft and heavy and impossibly, unexpectedly gentle. The coldness that had been seeping into her bones vanished instantly, replaced by a heat that seemed to wrap around her entire body like an embrace. She looked down. A cloak. A royal cloak of deepest midnight blue, embroidered with threads of silver and gold that caught the light of the chandeliers and shimmered like stars against the night sky. It was the most beautiful piece of fabric she had ever seen, worth more than everything she had ever owned in her entire life combined. And it was draped over her shoulders, covering her torn dress, protecting her exposed skin, shielding her from the stares of every wolf in the room. The silence in the great hall was absolute. Not a single creature dared to breathe. And then a voice spoke from directly behind her. A voice that was deep and rich and carried with it the weight of centuries of power and authority. A voice that somehow managed to be both terrifying and intoxicating at the same time. The voice said her name. Alina. Just that. Just her name. But the way it was spoken, with that perfect blend of recognition and intention, made her heart stop completely. Because the voice knew her. The Alpha King, who had never seen her before tonight, who should have had no idea that she even existed, had just spoken her name as though he had been waiting her entire life to say it. And as the implications of that single word began to sink in, as the wolves around her started to murmur in shock and disbelief, as Cassandra and Delilah and Vivian stared with expressions that had transformed from cruelty to absolute terror, Alina realized that everything she thought she knew about her own destiny was about to change. The storm outside broke. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the great hall in a flash of brilliant white light. Thunder rolled across the heavens like the roar of a god awakening from slumber. And somewhere deep inside Alina's chest, in that locked-away place where her silver wolf had been caged for 5 long years, something stirred. Something answered. Something that had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact night, this exact king, for longer than Alina could possibly comprehend. The hunt for the new Luna had just begun. But what no one in that hall understood yet, what even Alina herself had no way of knowing, was that she was not just a candidate in this selection. She was the reason it had been called in the first place. If this story has already wrapped its claws around your heart, if you are already desperate to know what happens next, then you belong here. Hit that subscribe button for Cynthia Shifter Romance and turn on the notification bell. Because this is only the beginning. This is only the first crack of thunder before the storm. And trust me when I tell you, the storm that is coming will change everything. Alina did not turn around. She could not turn around. Her body had become a statue of flesh and blood, frozen in place by the sheer impossibility of what was happening. The weight of the cloak on her shoulders was real. The warmth spreading through her bones was real. The voice that had spoken her name with such devastating familiarity was real. But none of it made sense. The Alpha King did not know her. He could not know her. She was nobody. She was less than nobody. She was the forgotten stepdaughter of a minor beta's widow, a girl who had spent the last 5 years scrubbing floors and dodging fists and trying desperately to be invisible. She had never attended a royal function. She had never been presented at court. She had never even glimpsed the Alpha King from a distance, much less been close enough for him to learn her name. And yet he had spoken it as though he had been carrying it with him for a very long time. The silence in the great hall stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Alina could feel the eyes of every wolf in the room boring into her back, could sense their confusion and shock and fear radiating outward like ripples in a disturbed pond. No one understood what was happening. No one had expected this. Least of all her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alina forced herself to move. It took every ounce of courage she had left, every fragment of strength she had not already spent on simply staying upright, but she made herself turn. Slowly, carefully, as though any sudden movement might shatter the strange, fragile bubble of unreality that had formed around this moment. And then she saw him. The Alpha King. Kale. That was his name. She had heard it whispered in fearful reverence throughout the kingdom for as long as she could remember. Kale, the Unbreakable. Kale, the Stormbringer. Kale, who had united the fractured packs under his rule through a combination of brilliant strategy and terrifying power. Kale, who had never been defeated in battle. Kale, who had ruled alone for over a decade, refusing every Luna candidate who had ever been presented to him, rejecting every political alliance that had been offered through marriage. Kale, who was now standing less than 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could count the individual threads of silver in his dark hair. He was not at all what she had expected. The stories had painted him as a monster, a creature of pure dominance and fury, with eyes like burning coals and a presence that could crush weaker wolves into submission without a single word being spoken. The rumors had described him as ancient despite his apparent youth, as cold as the mountain peaks where his ancestors had first claimed their territory, as merciless as the winter winds that swept across the northern territories every year without fail. But the man standing before her now, the king who had just draped his own royal cloak over her trembling shoulders, did not look like a monster. He looked like devastation given form. His features were sharp and aristocratic, all clean lines and dangerous angles that spoke of a bloodline that had been bred for power over countless generations. His jaw was strong, set in an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts, and a thin scar ran from just beneath his left eye down to the corner of his mouth, a pale reminder of some battle that had come closer to killing him than most. His hair was dark as a moonless night, swept back from his face in a way that seemed effortlessly elegant and somehow wild at the same time, and yes, there were threads of silver woven through it, though he could not have been more than 30 years old. But it was his eyes that stopped Alina's heart completely. They were the color of molten gold, bright and burning and utterly inhuman in their intensity. They seemed to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the chandeliers overhead, a light that came from somewhere deep within, from a power so ancient and so vast that it defied comprehension. Those eyes had seen things that Alina could not even imagine. They had witnessed wars and betrayals and deaths beyond counting. They held secrets that could shake the very foundations of the world. And right now, they were fixed entirely on her. Alina felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. She should lower her gaze. Every instinct drilled into her since childhood was screaming at her to submit, to bow her head, to show proper deference to the most powerful alpha in existence. Meeting his eyes directly was a challenge. It was an act of defiance. It was something that lesser wolves simply did not do, not if they valued their lives. But she could not look away. There was something in those golden depths that held her captive, something that went beyond the normal pull of alpha dominance. It was as if invisible threads had woven themselves between them in the space of a single heartbeat, binding her to him in ways she could not understand or explain. Her wolf, that silver creature she had kept caged for so long, was suddenly pressing against the walls of its prison with desperate urgency, not to attack, not to flee, but to get closer. To claim. To be claimed. The thought sent a shock of pure terror through Alina's system. No, that was not possible. That could not be happening. The mate bond was sacred, rare, a gift from the goddess herself that was bestowed upon only a handful of wolves in each generation. It was certainly not something that would ever touch someone like her. Someone broken. Someone cursed. Someone whose own pack had deemed her too dangerous to acknowledge. But her wolf did not seem to care about logic or probability or the countless reasons why this could not be real. Her wolf only knew one thing. Him. Kale continued to study her with those devastating golden eyes, his expression still unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete and absolute confidence. He stood with the easy grace of a predator who knew he had nothing to fear from anything in the room, his powerful frame radiating an aura of dominance that pressed against Alina's senses like a physical weight. He was tall, taller than any wolf she had ever encountered, and broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of years of battle and training. Beneath the fine fabric of his royal garments, she could see the suggestion of muscle, of strength that could crush or protect with equal ease. And he was still not speaking. The silence was becoming unbearable. Alina could feel the tension in the hall ratcheting higher with every passing moment, could sense the growing unease of the assembled wolves who had no idea what to make of this unprecedented scene. The Alpha King had never, in all the years of his rule, shown favor to any candidate at a Luna selection. He had never given his cloak to anyone. He had never spoken a candidate's name. Until now. Until her. Why? The question burned in Alina's mind, demanding an answer she did not have. Why would he do this? Why would he protect her, a nobody, a nothing, a girl whose own stepfamily had just torn her apart for the entertainment of the crowd? Why would he risk the confusion and speculation that this act would inevitably cause? Why would he look at her as though she were the only person in the entire hall worth seeing? She opened her mouth to speak, though she had no idea what she could possibly say. But before any sound could escape her lips, Cale moved. It was not a large movement. Just a single step forward, closing the already minimal distance between them until Alina could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the intoxicating scent of him washing over her like a wave. Pine and wood smoke and something electric, something that made her think of storms gathering on distant horizons, of lightning about to strike. He reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to flinch away if she chose to. But Alina did not flinch. She could not flinch. She was trapped in the gravity of him, pulled inexorably into his orbit, helpless to do anything but stand there as his fingers brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his power. The touch was featherlight, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt of electricity through every nerve in Alina's body. Her skin burned where he touched her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Her wolf howled in triumph, in recognition, in desperate, aching need. And something deep inside her, something that had been dormant for her entire life, suddenly stirred awake. It was not her wolf. Or rather, it was not only her wolf. It was something else, something older, something that lived in the silver light she had spent so long suppressing. It recognized Cale. It knew him. Not as a stranger, not as a king, but as something far more profound. Something that had been waiting for him, searching for him, calling out to him across distances she could not comprehend. The silver stirred beneath her skin, and for one terrifying moment, Alina was certain it would break free. But then Cale pulled his hand back, and the moment shattered like glass. The murmuring in the hall erupted into full-blown chaos. Voices rose from every corner, overlapping and competing, a cacophony of shock and outrage and confusion. Representatives from the major packs were demanding to know what was happening. Candidates who had spent months preparing for this night were staring at Alina with a mixture of jealousy and disbelief. Guards along the walls were shifting uneasily, unsure whether they should be doing something, protecting someone, though from what and from whom, no one seemed to know. And through it all, Cassandra and Delilah stood frozen in place, their earlier cruelty replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. Because they understood, even if no one else did yet, exactly how badly they had miscalculated. They had torn apart the dress of a nobody, a stray, a girl they had tormented for years without consequence. But the Alpha King had just marked that nobody as someone worth protecting. He had draped his royal cloak over her shoulders, an act that carried more political weight than most treaties. He had touched her face in full view of the entire kingdom, a gesture of intimacy that would be analyzed and discussed for generations. Whatever Alina had been before tonight, she was no longer that person. And whatever Cassandra and Delilah had done to her was no longer a private family matter. It was now an offense against the Alpha King himself. Vivian seemed to realize this at the same moment her daughters did. The older woman's face had gone the color of old parchment, her carefully maintained composure crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. She took a step back, then another, as though physically trying to distance herself from the crime her daughters had just committed. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For the first time in Alina's memory, her stepmother was speechless. But Alina could not take pleasure in that victory, because Cale was speaking again. His voice cut through the chaos of the hall like a blade through silk, instantly silencing every other sound. It was not loud. He did not need to shout. The power in his words was enough to command attention, to demand obedience, to remind every wolf present exactly who ruled this kingdom and whose word was absolute law. He made a declaration. A declaration that the Luna selection would proceed, but not as originally planned. A declaration that there had been a change, a development that required the candidates to be reconsidered and the criteria for selection to be adjusted. A declaration that he had been watching, waiting, and that what he had witnessed tonight had been very, very illuminating. His golden eyes swept across the assembled crowd, and wherever his gaze landed, wolves lowered their heads in submission. He looked at the representatives from the Mountain Claw Pack, and they fell silent. He looked at the delegates from the Crimson Moon territory, and they stopped their whispering. He looked at the warriors from the Shadowvale Forest, and even those stone-faced soldiers seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his attention. Then his gaze returned to Alina, and something in his expression shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that she doubted anyone else in the hall could have caught it. But Alina saw it. A flicker of something behind those burning golden eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. Not the kind of recognition that came from seeing a familiar face, but something deeper. Something that suggested he was not just seeing her physical form, but something else entirely. Something hidden. Something she had spent years trying to bury. He knew. The realization hit Alina like a physical blow. She did not know how he knew, or what exactly he had figured out, but she was suddenly, terrifyingly certain that the Alpha King could see past all her carefully constructed walls. He could see the silver light simmering beneath her skin. He could sense the power she had been suppressing since her first shift. He could feel the ancient, impossible thing that lived inside her, waiting for its moment to emerge. And instead of being afraid, instead of looking at her with the same horror that Vivian had shown all those years ago, he seemed almost pleased. As if he had been searching for exactly this. Exactly her. The thought should have been comforting. After a lifetime of being told she was wrong, broken, dangerous, cursed, here was the most powerful wolf in existence looking at her as though she were something precious. Something valuable. Something worth protecting. But Alina had learned long ago not to trust comfort. Every time she had allowed herself to hope, that hope had been ripped away from her with brutal efficiency. Every time she had believed that things might get better, the universe had conspired to remind her that she was destined for suffering. The dress lying in shreds beneath Cale's cloak was proof enough of that. So even as her wolf strained toward him, even as that strange silver power hummed with recognition and longing, Alina forced herself to be wary. What did he want from her? What was he really after? The Alpha King did not do anything without reason. He was known throughout the realm as a brilliant strategist, a master of political maneuvering, a man who could see 12 moves ahead on a chessboard while his opponents were still trying to figure out the rules of the game. Every action he took was calculated. Every word he spoke was chosen with precision. So why her? Why now? Why this public display of protection and favor when a quieter approach would have served just as well? Unless the public nature of it was the point. Unless he wanted everyone to see. The thought sent a chill down Alina's spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. She was being used. She had to be. There was no other explanation that made sense. The Alpha King had some plan, some scheme, some grand design that required a broken, powerless girl to be elevated in status. Maybe he wanted to send a message to the major packs. Maybe he was testing the loyalty of his court. Maybe he simply enjoyed causing chaos and watching lesser wolves scramble to understand his intentions. Whatever his reasons, they could not possibly be about her. Not really. Not genuinely. Because no one had ever wanted Alina for herself. Not her stepmother, who had only kept her alive because killing her outright would have raised too many questions. Not her stepsisters, who had only tolerated her presence because having someone to torment made them feel powerful. Not the pack she had grown up in, who had collectively decided to forget she existed rather than deal with the uncomfortable questions her existence raised. She was a tool at best, a burden at worst, and she had made peace with that fact long ago. Or so she had thought. But standing here now, wrapped in the Alpha King's cloak, pinned beneath the intensity of his golden gaze, Alina felt something shifting inside her. Something dangerous. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. She crushed that whisper ruthlessly. She could not afford hope. Not again. Not ever again. Cale must have seen something change in her expression, because his own eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He was reading her, she realized. Studying her the way a scholar might study an ancient text, looking for hidden meanings between the lines. He could probably see every wall she was throwing up, every defense she was constructing, every desperate attempt to keep him at a distance. And he did not seem deterred in the slightest. If anything, he seemed intrigued. As if her resistance was a puzzle he was looking forward to solving. The chaos in the hall was beginning to subside now, order slowly reasserting itself as the initial shock faded and the gathered wolves remembered how to behave in the presence of their king. But the tension remained, thick enough to choke on, and Alina could feel the weight of it pressing down on her from all sides. She needed to get out of here. She needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what was happening and what it meant, and how she was supposed to navigate a situation that had spiraled so far beyond her control. She needed to be anywhere but in the center of this hall, the focal point of hundreds of stairs, wrapped in a cloak that marked her as something she had never asked to be. But when she tried to step back, tried to create even a small distance between herself and the overwhelming presence of the Alpha King, Cale moved with her. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but with a clear intent that left no room for misunderstanding. He was not going to let her slip away into the shadows again. He was not going to allow her to retreat back into the invisibility that had protected her for so long. Whatever he had planned for her, whatever role he intended her to play, he was going to make sure she played it. His voice came again, softer this time, pitched low enough that only she could hear. The words he spoke were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to press directly against her soul. He told her that he had been waiting. He told her that he had known she would come. He told her that the time for hiding was over. And then, with a final look that seemed to burn straight through to her core, the Alpha King turned and addressed the crowd once more. He announced that the Luna selection would continue, but that the proceedings would be moved to the royal wing of the palace. He announced that all candidates who wished to remain under consideration should gather in the Moon Hall at midnight. He announced that there would be tests, trials, challenges designed to separate the worthy from the unworthy. But even as he spoke of selections and competitions and criteria for choosing a Luna, his meaning was clear to anyone paying attention. He had already made his choice. He had made it the moment he saw Alina standing in the ruins of her dress, alone and humiliated and fighting not to break. He had made it, perhaps, long before tonight. And now the entire kingdom was going to have to deal with the consequences. As the crowd began to disperse, as wolves moved toward the exits in murmuring clusters, as guards formed up around the royal dais in preparation for the king's departure, Alina remained frozen in place. The cloak around her shoulders felt heavier now, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. She had come to the Luna selection hoping to escape her stepfamily's cruelty. She had come hoping to find a new pack, a new home, a new start. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that she might find something else entirely. Something that frightened her far more than any beating or locked cellar or torn dress ever had. Hope. And the Alpha King who had just ignited it within her, who was even now walking away without a backward glance, carried with him secrets that would either save her or destroy her utterly. Only time would tell which it would be. The royal wing of the palace was nothing like the cold, austere spaces Alina had known her entire life. Where the Silver Ridge Pack's compound had been built for function rather than beauty, all rough stone walls and narrow corridors designed to withstand siege, these halls seemed to have been crafted by artists who had never known the meaning of restraint. Tapestries depicting ancient wolf legends hung from ceiling to floor, their threads woven with gold and silver that caught the torchlight and shimmered like living things. Marble floors so polished that Alina could see her own reflection stretched out before her with every step. Crystal sconces lined the walls at regular intervals, casting a warm, honeyed glow that made even the shadows seem inviting. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. And Alina had never felt more out of place in her entire life. A servant had appeared shortly after the Alpha King's departure, a small, mousy woman with kind eyes and quick hands who had introduced herself as Marin. She had led Alina away from the great hall through a maze of corridors and staircases, past guards who nodded respectfully and courtiers who stared with barely concealed curiosity, until they had finally arrived at a set of ornate double doors that Marin had opened with a flourish. The chambers beyond had stolen Alina's breath completely. A sitting room larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. A bedroom with a four-poster bed draped in silks so fine they looked like captured moonlight. A private bathing chamber with a sunken tub that could have fit half a dozen wolves comfortably. Windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of the palace gardens below, where fountains danced and night-blooming flowers perfumed the air. This was to be her room for the duration of the Luna selection. Her room. As if she were a real candidate. As if she belonged here. As if the Alpha King's cloak around her shoulders had somehow transformed her from a worthless servant girl into someone worthy of all this luxury. Marin had left her alone after a while, promising to return in the morning with appropriate clothing and anything else Alina might need. The servant had not asked questions about the torn dress, still visible beneath the royal cloak, had not commented on the dirt beneath Alina's fingernails or the calluses on her palms that spoke of years of hard labor. She had simply smiled, bowed, and departed, leaving Alina standing in the middle of this impossible room with no idea what to do next. So she did the only thing she could think of. She sat down on the floor, wrapped the Alpha King's cloak tighter around her body, and let herself finally fall apart. The tears came without warning and without mercy. They poured down her cheeks in hot, relentless streams, soaking into the fine fabric of the cloak, carrying with them years of suppressed grief and rage and terror that she had never been able to express. Her body shook with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in her chest, ugly, wrenching sounds that she muffled against her hands for fear that someone might hear. She cried for the dress that was ruined, her mother's last gift, the only tangible connection she had left to a woman who had loved her unconditionally. She cried for the humiliation she had endured in the great hall, the laughter and whispers and cruel stares that had stripped her bare in ways that went far beyond the physical. She cried for the 5 years of torment she had survived since her father's death, the beatings and the hunger and the cold nights locked in the cellar with nothing but her own thoughts for company. She cried for the child she had been, the girl who had believed in happy endings and justice and the fundamental goodness of the world, a girl who had been proven wrong so many times that she no longer existed except as a fading memory. And she cried for reasons she did not fully understand, for things she could not name, for losses she had not yet experienced, but somehow knew were coming. The tears seemed to go on forever. But eventually, as all storms must, they began to subside. Alina found herself lying on her side on the cold marble floor, her body curled into a tight ball, her breathing slowly returning to something approaching normal. The cloak was still wrapped around her, warm and solid and smelling faintly of pine and storms, and something uniquely, indefinably him. Kale, the Alpha King. Her mind kept circling back to him no matter how hard she tried to direct her thoughts elsewhere. The way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken her name, the way his touch had sent lightning coursing through her veins, awakening something that had been dormant for so long she had almost forgotten it existed. What did he want with her? The question haunted her, chasing itself around and around in endless circles that led nowhere. She had gone through every possibility she could think of, every potential explanation for his behavior, and none of them made sense. Political alliance made no sense because she had no power to offer. Romantic interest made no sense because she was nobody, nothing, a girl with no beauty or charm or social standing to recommend her. Even if he had somehow sensed her hidden power, the silver light she kept so carefully caged, that should have made him want to destroy her, not protect her. Unless he did not know what her power really was. Unless he thought it was something else entirely. The thought gave Alina a momentary sliver of hope before reality came crashing back down. The Alpha King was ancient in power if not in years. He had ruled the combined packs for over a decade, navigating political intrigues and military conflicts that would have crushed lesser wolves. He had not survived this long by being easily fooled or by misreading the nature of those around him. If he had looked at her and seen power, then he had seen true. And if he had decided to claim her anyway, despite the danger, despite the curse that everyone said followed wolves like her, then he had reasons that went beyond anything Alina could currently understand. She pushed herself up from the floor, her body aching in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The marble was hard beneath her palms, cold in a way that seemed to seep through her skin and into her bones. She needed to get up. She needed to think clearly. She needed to figure out what she was going to do now that her entire life had been turned upside down in the span of a single evening. But first, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to remember. The memories she had spent years suppressing were suddenly demanding to be acknowledged, rising up from the depths where she had buried them like corpses clawing their way out of shallow graves. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be felt. They wanted her to face the truth of what she was instead of continuing to hide from it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time. Alina closed her eyes and let the first memory take her. She was 6 years old again, small and bright-eyed and completely unaware of the tragedies that awaited her. Her mother was still alive then, a beautiful woman with silver-streaked hair and gentle hands who smelled of wildflowers and fresh bread. They were in the garden behind their cottage, surrounded by roses that her mother tended with an almost religious devotion, and the afternoon sun was warm on Alina's face. Her mother was telling her a story. It was a story about the old bloodlines, the ones that had existed before the packs had organized themselves into the structures that now governed wolf society. Back then, her mother explained, there had been wolves with special gifts, powers that went beyond the normal strength and speed and heightened senses of their kind. Some could control fire. Some could speak to the spirits of the dead. Some could see the future in dreams and visions. And some, the rarest of all, carried the silver flame. Alina remembered asking what the silver flame was. Her mother's expression had grown strange then, a mixture of pride and sorrow and something that might have been fear. She had explained that the silver flame was an ancient power, older than the packs themselves, older perhaps than the wolves. It was a gift from the moon goddess herself, passed down through certain bloodlines at seemingly random intervals. Sometimes generations would go by without a single silver bearer appearing. Sometimes 2 or 3 would be born in the same decade. The silver flame was neither good nor evil, her mother had said. It was simply power, vast and terrible and beautiful, a force that could heal or destroy depending on the heart of the one who wielded it. Silver bearers had once been revered as holy figures, consulted on matters of great importance, protected and honored by all the packs. But that was long ago. In more recent times, her mother had explained, the silver flame had come to be viewed with suspicion and fear. Silver bearers were hunted, killed, erased from history along with the knowledge of how to properly train and guide their abilities. The packs had decided that such power was too dangerous to be allowed to exist, that it threatened the careful balance of power that kept wolf society stable. Alina remembered asking why anyone would want to destroy something so beautiful. Her mother had smiled sadly and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Because people fear what they do not understand, she had said, and they destroy what they fear. The memory shifted, blurring at the edges before reforming into something sharper, more painful. She was 8 years old now, and her mother was dying. The sickness had come on suddenly, a fever that no healer could explain and no medicine could touch. Within a week, the vibrant, beautiful woman who had raised Alina with such love and devotion had been reduced to a pale shadow of herself, too weak to even lift her head from the pillow. Alina had stayed by her side day and night, refusing food and sleep, clinging to the desperate hope that somehow, if she just loved her mother hard enough, she could keep death at bay. But death did not care about the love of little girls. On the final night, when the fever had burned so hot that touching her mother's skin was like touching a flame, something strange had happened. Alina had been holding her mother's hand, crying and begging the moon goddess to show mercy, when she had felt a warmth begin to build in her own chest. It had started as a faint tingling sensation, easily dismissed, but it had grown rapidly, spreading through her body until her skin seemed to glow with a pale, silvery light. Her mother had opened her eyes then, those beautiful eyes that Alina had inherited, and she had smiled. It was a smile of recognition, of understanding, of something that might have been peace. She had reached up with a trembling hand and touched Alina's cheek, her fingers leaving trails of coolness against the warmth of the silver light. "You carry it," she had whispered. "The flame. My beautiful girl. You carry it." And then she had closed her eyes for the last time. Alina had screamed. The silver light had erupted from her body in a blinding flash, filling the entire room with brilliance that should have been impossible. Windows had shattered. Furniture had overturned. The walls had cracked and groaned as if the very structure of the cottage was struggling to contain the power that had been unleashed. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light had faded. Alina had been left alone in the dark, cradling her mother's lifeless body, too shocked and grief-stricken to understand what had just happened. She had been found like that hours later, rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby that her mother used to sing to her on stormy nights. The wolves who had come to investigate the strange phenomena had taken one look at the destruction surrounding the small girl and had drawn immediate, terrifying conclusions. The child had killed her own mother. That was the story that had spread through the pack like wildfire. That was the explanation that had been whispered in corners and shouted in council meetings and eventually accepted as truth by nearly everyone. The daughter of the beta's wife was a monster, a cursed creature who had murdered the woman who had given her life. It did not matter that there was no evidence to support this claim. It did not matter that Alina had loved her mother more than anything in the world. It did not matter that the sickness had been killing her mother for weeks before that final night. What mattered was the fear. What mattered was the silver light that everyone had seen, the impossible power that everyone had felt. What mattered was that the pack needed someone to blame, and Alina was the easiest target. Her father had tried to protect her in the beginning. Marcus, beta of the Silver Ridge pack, was a good man, an honorable man, who had loved his wife and daughter with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He had stood against the whispers and the accusations, had put his own reputation on the line to shield his little girl from the worst of the pack's hostility. But even he had not been able to protect her from the nightmares. Alina still remembered them with painful clarity, those terrible dreams that had plagued her in the months after her mother's death. Dreams of fire and destruction, of wolves screaming as silver flames consumed them, of a world reduced to ash and silence, with Alina standing at the center of it all, her hands raised, her eyes glowing, her heart cold and empty. She had woken from those nightmares screaming, the silver light flickering beneath her skin, and her father had held her and promised that everything would be all right. But it was not all right. It was never going to be all right again. The pack's fear had only grown as the months passed. Alina had been forbidden from attending pack gatherings, from playing with other children her age, from doing anything that might bring her into contact with wolves who might provoke another outbreak of that terrifying silver power. She had become a prisoner in her own home, isolated and alone, with only her father for company. And then her father had remarried. Vivian had seemed kind at first. She had smiled at Alina with warmth that appeared genuine, had spoken soft words about wanting to be a mother to her, had promised that they would be a family together, all of them, united by love. Alina, desperate for any source of affection, had believed her. She had believed her right up until the moment her father left for a diplomatic mission to the Northern Territories and did not come back. The news of his death had arrived on a cold winter morning, carried by a messenger who could not meet Alina's eyes as he delivered the words that shattered her world for the second time in 2 years. There had been an ambush, he had explained. Rogue wolves, probably, though no one could say for certain. The entire diplomatic party had been killed. There were no survivors. Alina had been 10 years old, and Vivian's mask had dropped the moment the messenger was out of sight. The woman who had pretended to be kind had revealed herself to be something else entirely. Cold, calculating, cruel in ways that Alina had not even known people could be. She had explained, in a voice that dripped with false sympathy, that things were going to change now. That Alina was no longer the daughter of the beta, but a burden that Vivian had been saddled with through no fault of her own. That if Alina wanted to continue living under this roof, eating this food, breathing this air, she was going to have to earn it. The beatings had started that same night. Cassandra and Delilah, Vivian's daughters from a previous marriage, had been eager participants. They were older than Alina by several years, already showing signs of the cruelty that would fully blossom in adulthood, and they had taken to their new roles as tormentors with frightening enthusiasm. Every minor infraction, real or imagined, had become an excuse for punishment. Every success Alina achieved had been reframed as evidence of her trying to show them up. Every tear she shed had been mockingly collected and displayed as proof of her weakness. And, through it all, the pack had done nothing. They had watched as a child was systematically broken down, stripped of her dignity and her sense of self, transformed from a bright-eyed girl into a hollow-eyed ghost who moved through life like a shadow. They had listened to her screams in the night and turned away. They had seen the bruises on her skin and pretended not to notice. Because she was cursed. Because she was dangerous. Because whatever happened to her, no matter how terrible, was probably deserved. The memory of her first shift rose up next, unbidden and unwelcome. She had been 13, locked in the cellar as punishment for some transgression she could not even remember now. The full moon had been rising outside, invisible to her through the stone walls and the heavy door that kept her imprisoned, but she had felt it nonetheless. A pull in her blood, an ache in her bones, a pressure building behind her eyes that grew stronger with every passing moment. She had not known what was happening. No one had told her. No one had prepared her. She had been kept so isolated from normal pack life that she had never witnessed another wolf's first shift, had never been taught what to expect or how to handle the transformation. So when the pain had come, sudden and overwhelming and absolutely inescapable, She had been completely unprepared. The memory of that night still haunted her. The sound of her own bones breaking and reforming. The sensation of fur pushing through her skin in waves of agony. The terror of feeling her body become something alien, something other, something that was still her but also not her at the same time. And when it was over, when she had finally opened her eyes and looked down at herself, she had seen the silver. Her fur had been white, impossibly white, like fresh snow under starlight. But threaded through that white were streaks of silver that seemed to glow with their own inner light, pulsing gently in time with her heartbeat. Her eyes, when she caught a glimpse of them in a shard of broken glass, had been violet, bright and luminous and utterly unlike any wolf eyes she had ever seen. She had been beautiful. She had been terrifying. She had been exactly what everyone had always feared she would become. Vivian's reaction when she finally emerged from the cellar had confirmed every terrible suspicion Alina had been harboring since her mother's death. The horror on her stepmother's face, the way she had recoiled as if from a striking snake, the words she had spoken in a voice that trembled with genuine fear, all of it had made clear that whatever Alina was, it was something that the pack could not accept. Would not accept. From that day forward, Alina had been forbidden from shifting. Vivian had made it clear that if anyone ever saw her wolf form, if anyone ever witnessed the silver light that marked her as something ancient and dangerous, the consequences would be fatal. The pack would demand her death. The council would order her execution. There would be no trial, no defense, no opportunity to plead her case. She would simply be erased, like so many silver bearers before her. So Alina had learned to keep her wolf caged. It had been the hardest thing she had ever done. Wolves were not meant to suppress their other halves. The human and the beast were supposed to exist in harmony, each supporting and strengthening the other. Denying the shift was like denying breath, like denying hunger, like denying every natural instinct that made her what she was. But she had done it. For 5 long years, she had kept her wolf locked away in a corner of her mind, ignoring its howls and its pleas and its desperate attempts to break free. She had learned to move through life as if she were only human, suppressing every trace of the power that simmered beneath her skin, pretending to be normal even when every fiber of her being screamed that she was anything but. And now here she was, sitting on the floor of a room that belonged in a fairy tale, wrapped in the cloak of the Alpha King himself, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a sandcastle before the tide. Alina opened her eyes, pulling herself back to the present with an effort that left her feeling drained and hollow. The memories had served their purpose. They had reminded her of who she was, where she came from, why she had learned to never trust anyone, never hope for anything, never allow herself to want things that could only be taken away. But they had also reminded her of something else. The silver flame was real. It lived inside her still, patient and powerful and waiting for its moment. It had not faded despite years of suppression. It had not weakened despite her desperate attempts to deny its existence. It was there, coiled at the center of her being like a sleeping dragon, ready to awaken at the first sign of need. And the Alpha King had looked at her as if he could see it. As if he wanted it. As if he had been searching for exactly this, exactly her, for reasons she could not begin to fathom. The thought should have terrified her. After a lifetime of being taught that her power was a curse, that it would bring nothing but destruction and death, the idea of someone actively seeking it out should have sent her running for the nearest exit. But instead, she felt something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her with full knowledge of what she was and had not turned away in fear. For the first time, someone had seen the silver light stirring beneath her skin and had chosen to step closer instead of farther away. For the first time, someone had wrapped her in protection instead of chains. It did not make sense. It could not possibly be real. But Kale's cloak was still warm around her shoulders, still carrying his scent, still marking her as someone under his protection. And his eyes, those burning golden eyes, had held something that looked almost like recognition when they met hers. As if he knew her. As if he had been waiting for her. As if everything that had happened in the Great Hall, the torn dress and the humiliation and the chaos that followed, had been leading to a moment that was written in the stars long before either of them was born. Alina did not believe in destiny. She had stopped believing in anything the night her mother died, the night the silver light erupted from her body for the first time, the night she realized that the universe was not kind and life was not fair, and hoping for things only made it hurt more when they were taken away. But something about Cale made her want to believe again. Something about the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken her name, the way he had touched her face with such unexpected gentleness, had reached past all her walls and found the small, wounded part of her that still remembered how to hope. It was dangerous. It was foolish. It would probably destroy her. But as Alina sat there on the floor of her impossible room, wrapped in the cloak of a king who should have been her enemy, she found that she could not quite bring herself to care. For the first time in 5 years, she felt something other than fear and pain and exhaustion. She felt alive. And whatever came next, whatever trials awaited her in the days to come, she was going to face them with her head held high. Even if it killed her. Especially if it killed her. Because she was done hiding. Done running. Done pretending to be less than she was. The silver flame was waking up inside her, responding to something it sensed in this place, in this palace, in the Alpha King who had claimed her with nothing more than a cloak and a name. And when it finally emerged, when she finally stopped fighting what she was and embraced the full extent of her power, the world was going to burn. The only question was whether it would be a cleansing fire. Or a funeral pyre. Sleep did not come for Alina that night. She had tried. She had forced herself up from the cold marble floor, had shed her ruined dress and the Alpha King's cloak with trembling hands, had lowered herself into the sunken tub that Marin had prepared before leaving. The water had been warm, scented with lavender and something sweeter that she could not identify, and she had soaked in it until her skin pruned and the trembling in her limbs finally subsided. But when she had crawled into the massive bed with its silk sheets and mountain of pillows, when she had closed her eyes and willed her exhausted mind to rest, the darkness behind her eyelids had not brought peace. It had brought visions. They came in fragments at first, disjointed images that flickered through her consciousness like lightning across a stormy sky. A great wolf with fur of pure silver standing atop a mountain peak. An ancient altar carved from moonstone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and dance in the pale light. A woman with Alina's own face, but older, harder, wreathed in flames that burned silver white against an endless darkness. And eyes. Golden eyes that watched from the shadows, patient and hungry and utterly, terrifyingly familiar. Alina had jolted awake with a gasp, her heart pounding, her skin slick with sweat despite the cool night air drifting through the open windows. The silver light was flickering beneath her skin again, pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat, responding to whatever had touched her dreams with an eagerness that bordered on desperation. She did not sleep again after that. Instead, she had wrapped herself in the softest robe she could find in the wardrobe, the fabric so fine it felt like wearing clouds, and she had curled up on the window seat overlooking the palace gardens. She had watched the moon complete its journey across the sky, had seen the first pale fingers of dawn reach up from the eastern horizon, had counted her breaths and tried to make sense of a world that no longer followed any rules she understood. When the knock came at her door, she was almost grateful for the interruption. Marin entered with a tray of food that smelled like heaven and looked like art, delicate pastries and fresh fruit, and something hot that steamed gently in a porcelain cup. She had also brought clothing, a simple but elegant dress in deep forest green that fit Alina as if it had been made specifically for her body. Perhaps it had. Alina did not ask questions. She ate because her body demanded fuel even when her mind wanted nothing to do with sustenance. She dressed because refusing would only draw more attention, more questions, more of the scrutiny she had been trying to avoid her entire life. She let Marin brush and braid her hair, the servant's gentle fingers working through tangles with patient efficiency, and she stared at her own reflection in the mirror with the eyes of a stranger. The girl looking back at her was not the same girl who had entered the Luna selection the night before. That girl had been beaten down, broken, resigned to a lifetime of suffering and obscurity. That girl had worn her mother's dress like armor and her invisibility like a shield. That girl had expected nothing from the world except more pain, more disappointment, more proof that she was exactly as worthless as everyone said she was. But this girl, the one wrapped in green silk with her silver-streaked hair braided like a crown, had been touched by something she could not explain. This girl had been claimed by an alpha king who should not have known her name. This girl had felt the stirring of an ancient power in her blood and had not run away. This girl was dangerous. Alina was still contemplating her own reflection when the summons came. A guard in royal livery appeared at her door, his expression carefully neutral, his posture rigidly formal. The Alpha King requested her presence, he announced. She was to follow him immediately. There was no room for refusal in his tone, no suggestion that this was a request she could decline. Alina went. The walk through the palace took longer than she expected. They passed through corridors she had not seen the night before, descending staircases that spiraled down into the very foundations of the ancient structure, moving through spaces that grew progressively older and more weathered as they went. The polished marble gave way to rougher stone. The crystal sconces were replaced by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on walls covered in carved symbols. These symbols caught Alina's attention immediately. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, intricate patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. Some looked like wolves in various stages of transformation, their bodies twisted into shapes that were neither fully human nor fully beast. Others resembled flames, frozen in stone, but somehow still conveying a sense of heat and movement. And woven throughout all of them were spirals that could have represented anything from the phases of the moon to the cycles of life and death and rebirth. The silver light inside Alina stirred as they passed each carved symbol, responding to some resonance she could not consciously perceive. It was as if the stones themselves were speaking to her, calling out to the power in her blood, welcoming her home to a place she had never been. She tried to ignore it. She failed. The guard finally stopped before a door that looked older than the palace itself, its surface blackened by centuries of smoke and age, its iron hinges rusted but still solid. He gestured for Alina to proceed, making it clear that his role as escort ended here, and then he turned and walked back the way they had come without a single word of explanation. Alina stood alone in the flickering torchlight, staring at the ancient door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. Whatever was behind this door was important. Whatever was waiting for her in that hidden chamber was going to change everything. She knew it with a certainty that went beyond logic, beyond reason, beyond anything her rational mind could explain. The silver inside her knew it too, pressing against its cage with renewed urgency, desperate to see what lay beyond that weathered wood and rusted iron. Alina pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was not what she expected. She had braced herself for darkness, for dust, for the musty smell of ancient spaces long forgotten by the living. But instead, she found herself stepping into a room filled with soft, silvery light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air was cool and clean, carrying a faint scent of night-blooming flowers and something older, something that reminded her of her mother's garden on summer evenings. The chamber was circular, perhaps 50 feet across, with a domed ceiling that arched high overhead. Every inch of the walls was covered in those strange, shifting symbols she had seen in the corridor, but here they seemed more alive, more present, pulsing with a gentle luminescence that matched the silver light stirring beneath her skin. And in the center of the room, Rising from the stone floor like a monument to something sacred was an altar. It was carved from a single piece of moonstone, that rare mineral that was said to hold the blessing of the goddess herself. Its surface was polished to a mirror-bright sheen, reflecting the silvery light of the chamber in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost meaningful. Around its base, more symbols had been carved, these ones different from the others, more elaborate, more ancient, carrying a weight of significance that pressed against Alina's consciousness like a physical force. She was not alone. Kale stood on the far side of the altar, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was dressed simply today, dark trousers and a linen shirt that was open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat and the beginning of what looked like a tattoo or perhaps a scar spreading across his chest. His dark hair was unbound, falling around his face in waves that softened his sharp features and made him look almost approachable. Almost. But his eyes told a different story. Those burning golden depths held knowledge that Alina could not begin to fathom, secrets that had been kept for centuries, truths that would shatter her understanding of the world if he chose to reveal them. He was not just a king standing before her. He was a keeper of mysteries, a guardian of something ancient and powerful and deeply, terrifyingly real. And he had brought her here for a reason. Alina forced herself to move forward, one step at a time, until she stood on the opposite side of the altar from the Alpha King. The moonstone surface between them seemed to hum with suppressed energy, responding to their presence, to the power that both of them carried in their blood. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was different here than it had been in the Great Hall the night before. That silence had been loaded with politics and social expectation, with the weight of hundreds of watching eyes and the pressure of centuries of tradition. This silence was something else entirely. It was sacred. It was intimate. It was the kind of silence that existed between two people who were about to share something that could never be unshared. Kale broke it first. He spoke of the old times, when the packs were not yet formed and wolves roamed the wild lands in small family groups, answering to no authority but the moon herself. He spoke of the first Alpha, a wolf of legendary power who had united the scattered families into something greater, something stronger, something that could stand against the threats that lurked in the darkness beyond the firelight. He spoke of the gifts that the moon goddess had bestowed upon her chosen children, the special abilities that marked certain bloodlines as touched by the divine. His voice was low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and Alina found herself falling into the story as if she were living it rather than simply hearing it. He spoke of the silver flame. It was the rarest of all the gifts, he explained, the most powerful and the most dangerous. Those who carried it were connected to the moon goddess in ways that other wolves could not comprehend. They could heal wounds that should have been fatal. They could see truths that others desperately tried to hide. They could channel the very essence of moonlight through their bodies, transforming it into a force that could create or destroy with equal ease. The Silver Bearers had been revered once. They had served as advisors to the early Alphas, as mediators in disputes between the packs, as healers and protectors and guides for their people. They had been the living bridges between the physical world and the realm of spirits, able to communicate with ancestors who had passed beyond the veil and with the goddess herself. But that was long ago. As the centuries passed and the packs grew more organized, more political, more focused on earthly power than divine connection, the Silver Bearers had begun to be viewed with suspicion. Their abilities were too unpredictable. Their loyalties were too unclear. They answered to the moon goddess first and to the pack alphas second, and that made them dangerous to those who valued control above all else. So the purges had begun. Kale's voice grew heavy as he described what had been done to the Silver Bearers in the generations that followed. Hunted like animals. Executed without trial. Erased from the historical records as if they had never existed. Entire bloodlines had been wiped out in the name of security, in the name of order, in the name of a fear so deep and so irrational that it had consumed everything in its path. By the time Kale's own grandfather had taken the throne, the silver bearers were believed to be extinct. But they were not. They had simply learned to hide. Scattered across the kingdom, disguised as ordinary wolves, the descendants of the silver bloodlines had survived in secret. They had passed their knowledge down through generations, whispered in the darkness of cellars and the depths of forests, preserved in coded messages and hidden rituals that the pack authorities never discovered. They had waited, patient and silent, for the time when it would be safe to reveal themselves again. For the time when the prophecy would be fulfilled. Alina felt the blood drain from her face as Cale spoke that word. Prophecy. He moved around the altar as he continued his explanation, his steps slow and deliberate, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The prophecy was ancient, he told her, older than the purges, older than the organized packs, older perhaps than the alpha bloodlines themselves. It spoke of a time of great darkness, when the old enemies would return and the wolf packs would stand on the brink of extinction. It spoke of a war that would shake the very foundations of their world. And it spoke of a silver bearer who would rise to turn the tide. The words of the prophecy had been preserved in fragments scattered across the kingdom, hidden in ancient texts and carved into sacred stones and passed down through the oral traditions of the oldest wolf families. Cale had spent decades gathering those fragments, piecing them together like a puzzle that spanned centuries, trying to understand what was coming and how to prepare for it. The prophecy spoke of the child of the flame, born of sorrow and tempered by suffering. It spoke of one who would carry the silver light through years of darkness, hiding it from those who would destroy it, protecting it until the moment of awakening. It spoke of a mark, a sign that would identify the chosen one when the time was right, a visible proof that could not be denied or dismissed. And it spoke of the bond. The silver bearer would be bound to the Alpha King by something deeper than politics or choice. Their souls would recognize each other across any distance, through any obstacle, despite any attempt to keep them apart. When they finally came together, their combined power would be enough to stand against the darkness that was coming. If they could learn to trust each other. If they could survive long enough to fulfill their destiny. Alina was shaking her head before Cale finished speaking, denial rising up in her throat like bile. This could not be real. This could not be happening. She was nobody, nothing, a broken girl from a minor pack who had spent her entire life being told that she was worthless and cursed and better off dead. She was not the subject of ancient prophecies. She was not destined to save the world. She was not bound by fate to the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. She was just Alina. Just the girl who scrubbed floors and endured beatings and slept in cellars and dreamed of a mother who had died too soon. The silver light inside her flared in response to her distress, pressing against her skin with an urgency that bordered on pain. It disagreed with her denial. It knew something she did not want to accept. It was trying to show her a truth that her conscious mind was desperately attempting to reject. Cale closed the remaining distance between them, stopping so close that Alina could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that intoxicating scent of pine and storms that clung to him like a second skin. His golden eyes bored into hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, that stripped away all her defenses and left her naked before his gaze. He lifted his hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his palm against the center of her chest. The reaction was instantaneous. The silver light that Alina had been suppressing for years erupted from her skin in a blinding wave of brilliance. It poured out of her like water from a shattered dam, filling the chamber with a radiance so pure and so powerful that it should have been painful to witness. The symbols on the walls blazed to life, responding to the light, adding their own glow to the overwhelming luminescence that surrounded them. And the moonstone altar between them began to sing. It was not a sound that could be heard with human ears. It was something deeper, something that resonated in the bones and the blood and the very soul of every creature within range. It was the voice of the moon goddess herself, calling out across the centuries, welcoming home a daughter who had been lost for far too long. Alina could not breathe. She could not think. She could barely stand as the power she had kept caged for so long finally broke free of its restraints. And in that moment of overwhelming release, she saw. Visions flooded her mind, more vivid and more detailed than the fragments that had haunted her sleepless night. She saw the great wolf from her dreams, the one with silver fur, and she realized with a shock that it was her own wolf, not as it currently existed, but as it was meant to be. She saw armies of shadow creatures pouring across the land, bringing death and destruction wherever they went. She saw the packs falling one by one, their territories consumed by darkness that no ordinary power could hold back. And she saw herself, standing at the center of a great battlefield, silver flames wreathing her body like armor, her eyes blazing with a light that matched the full moon overhead. She saw Cale at her side, his own power manifest in golden light that intertwined with her silver, the two of them standing together against a wave of darkness that seemed to stretch to infinity. She saw them winning. She saw them losing. She saw 1,000 possible futures branching out from this single moment, this single choice, this single question of whether she would accept what she was or continue to run from it. The visions faded as suddenly as they had come, leaving Alina gasping and trembling in the aftermath. The silver light was slowly receding back into her body, the chamber returning to its normal gentle glow, the song of the moonstone altar fading into silence. But something had changed. Alina could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the very core of her being. A door that had been locked for her entire life had finally been opened, and there was no closing it again. She knew what she was now. She understood, at least in part, why she had been born with this power and why it had been so important for her to survive long enough to reach this moment. She was the child of the flame. She was the one the prophecy spoke of. She was meant for this. But even as that knowledge settled into her consciousness, doubt followed close behind. How could she possibly be the one? How could a girl who had been broken so thoroughly, who had spent years believing she was worthless, who had never been taught to use or control the power she carried, how could she be expected to save anyone? She had not even been able to save herself. Cale seemed to sense her doubt, because he spoke again, his voice softer now, almost gentle. He told her that he had not believed it either, at first. When his advisors had first brought him the fragments of the prophecy, when they had suggested that the silver bearers might not be as extinct as everyone believed, he had dismissed them as fools chasing legends. But then he had felt her. Years ago, when he was still a young king trying to find his footing in a world of political intrigue and constant threat, he had experienced something he could not explain. A tug in his chest, like an invisible thread connecting him to something far away. A sense of presence, of another soul that matched his own in ways he had not known were possible. It had been faint at first, barely perceptible, easy to dismiss as imagination or wishful thinking. But it had never gone away. As the years passed, the connection had grown stronger. He had felt echoes of emotions that were not his own, fear and pain and a loneliness so profound that it had brought him to his knees on more than one occasion. He had searched for the source of that connection, had sent his most trusted people to investigate rumors of unusual children born in packs across the kingdom, had followed every lead and chased every possibility. And then, last night, he had felt her enter the great hall. The moment Alina had crossed the threshold of the palace, Cale had known. The faint thread that had connected them for so long had suddenly blazed to life, a rope of golden light leading directly to her. He had watched from the shadows as she moved through the crowd, had seen the way she held herself despite the fear in her eyes, had recognized the silver stirring beneath her skin even when she was trying so desperately to hide it. He had not planned to reveal himself so dramatically. He had intended to observe, to gather information, to approach her carefully and privately once the selection was underway. But then her stepsisters had attacked, and the dress had been torn, and she had stood there in the ruins of her dignity with such fierce, broken pride that something inside him had snapped. He could not watch her suffer. Not when she was his. Not when they were bound together by something stronger than politics or tradition or the expectations of a kingdom that had no idea what was coming for them. Alina listened to his words, feeling the truth of them resonate with the silver light that now moved freely beneath her skin. She could feel the connection he was describing, could sense the thread that linked them together, golden on his end and silver on hers, woven together into something that could not be easily cut. But she was not ready to trust it. She was not ready to trust him. Too many years of pain and betrayal had taught her that what seemed like salvation was often just another trap wearing a prettier face. Cale might believe everything he was telling her. The prophecy might be real. The bond between them might be genuine. But that did not mean she could simply surrender herself to a destiny she had not chosen and a man she did not know. She needed time. She needed proof. She needed to understand who she truly was before she could even begin to figure out who she was meant to become. Cale seemed to understand this without her having to say a word. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her room to breathe. His golden eyes remained fixed on her face, but the intensity in them had softened into something that looked almost like patience. He told her that the Luna selection would continue as planned. The other candidates would go through the trials, would compete for the position they believed was still available. No one outside this chamber would know what had truly transpired here, what had been revealed, what had been set in motion. This would give Alina time. Time to learn about her power. Time to explore the histories that had been hidden from her. Time to decide for herself whether she believed in prophecies and destiny and bonds that were written in the stars. He would not force her. He would not claim her publicly until she was ready. But he would not pretend either. She was his. He was hers. That was a truth that existed independent of either of their choices, a reality that would remain constant regardless of how long it took her to accept it. He could wait. He had been waiting for years already. He would wait for as long as she needed. But the darkness would not wait. The enemy that the prophecy spoke of was already moving, already gathering strength in the shadows beyond the borders of the kingdom. The signs had been appearing for months, whispered reports of villages destroyed and scouts gone missing and creatures that did not belong in the mortal realm glimpsed at the edges of the wild lands. War was coming, and when it arrived, Alina would need to be ready. She would need to have claimed her power fully, would need to have learned to wield the silver flame with precision and purpose, would need to have accepted her role as the child of the flame, whether she wanted to or not. Alina stood in the sacred chamber, surrounded by the glow of ancient symbols and the echo of a prophecy that had been waiting centuries for this moment, and she felt the weight of destiny settling onto her shoulders like a mantle she had not asked to wear. She was terrified. She was overwhelmed. She was completely, utterly out of her depth. But somewhere beneath all of that, buried under years of trauma and self-doubt and the endless voice in her head that whispered she would never be enough, something else was stirring. Hope, and anger, and a determination that surprised even her. If she was truly the one the prophecy spoke of, if she was truly meant to stand against the darkness that was coming, then she was going to do it on her own terms. She was going to learn everything there was to know about her power. She was going to train until she could wield the silver flame with the same ease that she breathed. She was going to become strong enough that no one, not her stepfamily, not the wolves who had whispered about her being cursed, not the enemies lurking in the shadows, would ever be able to break her again. And if the Alpha King thought he could simply claim her because some ancient prophecy said she was his, he was going to learn that Alina was not a possession to be owned. She was a force to be reckoned with. And she was just getting started. The morning after the revelation in the sacred chamber found Alina standing in a training courtyard she had not known existed. It was hidden deep within the palace grounds, accessible only through a series of passages that seemed designed to confuse anyone who did not already know the way. The space was larger than she had expected, surrounded by high stone walls that had been weathered by centuries of use, their surfaces scarred with what looked like claw marks and burn marks and impact craters that told stories of countless training sessions that had turned violent. The sky above was the color of old bruises, heavy clouds rolling in from the north carrying the promise of rain that had not yet begun to fall. The air tasted of electricity and approaching storms, and something in Alina's blood responded to it with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her. She was not alone. Kale had arranged for a trainer, someone who understood what she was and what she needed to learn. The woman who stood waiting in the center of the courtyard looked nothing like Alina had expected. She was small, barely reaching Alina's shoulder, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe braid and eyes that were so pale they appeared almost colorless. Her frame was slight, almost fragile-looking, but there was something about the way she held herself that suggested she was anything but weak. Her name was Thora, and she had been waiting for Alina for a very long time. She did not waste words on pleasantries or introductions beyond stating her name. Instead, she had looked Alina up and down with those unsettling pale eyes, studying her the way a craftsman might study a piece of raw material before deciding how to shape it, and then she had spoken a single sentence that had sent ice flooding through Alina's veins. "You have no idea what you are carrying inside you, do you?" Alina had not known how to answer that. The events in the sacred chamber were still too fresh, too overwhelming to have been fully processed. She knew she was a silver bearer. She knew there was a prophecy. She knew the Alpha King believed she was meant for something that went beyond anything she had ever imagined for herself. But understanding those facts intellectually was very different from comprehending what they actually meant. Thora seemed to sense her confusion, because her expression had softened slightly, a crack appearing in the stern facade she presented to the world. She had explained that she herself had been born to a silver bloodline, though her power had manifested differently than Alina's would. She could not wield the flame, could not channel the raw destructive force that lived in Alina's blood. But she could teach. She could guide. She could show Alina how to access the power without being consumed by it. If Alina was willing to learn. If Alina was willing to endure what learning would require. The training had begun immediately. Thora did not believe in easing students into their power gradually. She believed in throwing them into the deep end and seeing if they could swim or if they would drown. So within minutes of their first meeting, Alina had found herself standing in the center of the courtyard with instructions to call forth the silver light that had erupted so spectacularly in the sacred chamber. "Just call it," Thora had said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Feel it inside you. Acknowledge it. Invite it to the surface." Alina had tried. She had closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for that familiar warmth that had been growing stronger since the night of the Lunas election. She had felt it there, coiled in her chest like a sleeping serpent, humming with suppressed energy. She had extended her awareness toward it, had tried to coax it gently toward the surface the way she might coax a frightened animal from its hiding place. Nothing had happened. The silver light had remained stubbornly dormant, refusing to respond to her tentative mental prodding. Alina had tried again, pushing harder this time, demanding rather than asking, and still nothing. The power that had come so easily in Kale's presence seemed to have retreated to some unreachable place inside her, locked away behind walls she could not break through. Frustration had built with each failed attempt. Thora had watched in silence, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts, and that silence had somehow made everything worse. Alina had felt like a failure, like a fraud, like someone who had no business claiming to be the subject of ancient prophecies when she could not even perform the most basic manipulation of her own power. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Thora had finally spoken. "You are trying to control it," she had said. "That is your mistake. The silver flame does not respond to control. It responds to truth. Alina had not understood. Thora had stepped closer, her pale eyes boring into Alina's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. She had explained that the silver flame was not like ordinary wolf abilities that could be summoned through force of will or practice technique. It was connected to something deeper, something that existed at the very core of who Alina was. It responded to emotion, to need, to the raw, unfiltered truth of her inner self. When the power had emerged in the sacred chamber, it had done so because Alina had been confronted with a truth she could no longer deny. When it had erupted on the night her mother died, it had been responding to grief so profound that her carefully constructed walls had shattered completely. The silver flame did not come when called like a trained hound. It came when the soul cried out in a voice that could not be ignored. So if Alina wanted to learn to wield it, she needed to stop trying to control it and instead learn to be honest with herself in ways that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. She needed to feel. The revelation had been both liberating and terrifying. Alina had spent years building walls around her emotions, suppressing anything that might draw unwanted attention or provoke her stepfamily's cruelty. She had become an expert at numbness, at disconnection, at existing in a state of careful emotional neutrality that allowed her to survive one day at a time without being destroyed by the weight of her own pain. And now Thora was asking her to tear down all those walls, to feel everything she had been avoiding, to let the silver flame feed on the very emotions she had worked so hard to bury. The first real breakthrough had come when Thora had asked a simple question. What makes you angry? Alina had opened her mouth to say that nothing made her angry, that she had learned long ago to accept her circumstances with quiet resignation. But the words had died on her tongue because they were a lie and Thora would know it. What makes you angry? The question had echoed in her mind, demanding a true answer. And the truth was that everything made her angry. She was angry at her stepfamily for years of cruelty. Angry at the pack that had turned their backs on a grieving child. Angry at her father for dying and leaving her alone. Angry at her mother for the same reason, even though she knew that made no sense. Angry at the moon goddess for giving her a power she had never asked for and then allowing that power to be used as justification for her abuse. Angry at herself for being weak, for surviving when maybe she should have found the courage to fight back, for allowing herself to be broken down into something small and scared and powerless. The anger had been waiting just beneath the surface of a reservoir of rage so deep and so vast that acknowledging its existence felt like opening a door to something that could never be closed again. And when she had finally let herself feel it, when she had stopped pushing it down and instead allowed it to rise up and fill every corner of her consciousness, the silver light had come roaring to life. It had burst from her skin in waves of brilliance that had illuminated the entire courtyard, turning the gray morning into something that looked like noon under a summer sun. The stones beneath her feet had cracked. The air around her had shimmered with heat. And Thora had stepped back with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been concern. It was impossible to tell. Good, the older woman had said simply. Now do it again. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of training that had left Alina exhausted in ways she had not known were possible. Every muscle in her body ached. Her head throbbed with a constant low-grade pain that no amount of rest seemed to relieve. Her emotions felt raw and exposed, stripped of the protective numbness she had relied on for so long. But she was learning. She was learning to call the silver flame at will, though it still required her to tap into emotions that she would rather have kept buried. She was learning to shape it, to direct it, to pour it into specific forms rather than letting it explode outward in every direction. She was learning the difference between destruction and creation, between burning something to ash and using heat to forge something stronger. And she was learning that power came with a price. Every time she channeled the silver flame, she felt something drain from her. Not physical energy, though that was certainly depleted, but something deeper. Something that felt essential to who she was. It was as if the power was fed not just by her emotions, but by her very life force, burning through years she might have lived in exchange for moments of transcendent ability. Thora had warned her about this. The silver flame was a gift, but it was also a burden. Used carelessly, it could consume the bearer from within, burning them out until nothing remained but an empty husk. The greatest silver bearers of the past had all died young, their bodies unable to sustain the power they wielded, their spirits extinguished like candles in a hurricane. But used wisely, with understanding and respect for its nature, the power could last a lifetime. It was a balance that Alina was only beginning to understand. She was standing in the center of the courtyard now, 3 days into her training, attempting to maintain a sphere of silver light suspended between her hands. Thora had instructed her to hold it steady, to keep it from collapsing or expanding, to maintain perfect control while simultaneously allowing the power to flow naturally. It should have been impossible. And yet, after hours of practice and countless failures, Alina was doing it. The sphere hung in the air before her, about the size of her fist, pulsing gently with each breath she took. It was beautiful and terrifying, a miniature star captured in the space between her palms, warm enough that she could feel the heat on her skin, but controlled enough that it was not burning her. She was so focused on maintaining the sphere that she did not notice the commotion at first. The sound of running footsteps, raised voices echoing off the courtyard walls. The sharp tang of fear that suddenly filled the air, cutting through even the concentration required to hold her power steady. Thora noticed, though. The older woman's head snapped up, her pale eyes narrowing as she scanned the entrance to the courtyard. Her entire body went rigid, tension flowing through her frame like water through a streambed, and that reaction alone was enough to break Alina's concentration. The sphere of silver light flickered and died. Alina turned toward the source of the disturbance just as 3 figures burst into the courtyard, moving with the kind of urgency that spoke of genuine crisis rather than simple concern. 2 were guards she recognized from the palace, their faces flushed with exertion, their hands resting on the weapons at their belts. The 3rd was someone Alina had not seen before, a young woman with wild auburn hair and eyes that were too wide, too bright, carrying the unmistakable signs of panic barely held in check. They were looking for her. The realization hit Alina like a physical blow. Whatever was happening, whatever crisis had sent these people running through the palace grounds, it had something to do with her. The lead guard spoke first, his words coming out in a rush that made them difficult to follow. There was a situation. The Luna selection candidates had been summoned to the throne room for what was supposed to be a routine meeting. But someone had made an accusation. Someone had claimed that Alina was not what she seemed, that her presence in the selection was a deception, that she had used dark magic to influence the Alpha King. Cassandra. The guard did not need to say her stepsister's name. Alina knew. She could feel the truth of it settling into her bones with the cold certainty of winter frost. Of course Cassandra would not accept what had happened in the Great Hall. Of course she would find some way to strike back, to try to reclaim the narrative, to paint Alina as the villain in a story where Cassandra herself had been the one wielding cruelty like a weapon. The accusation was absurd on its face. Alina had no knowledge of dark magic, no ability to manipulate or control the minds of others. The Alpha King had claimed her of his own free will, for reasons that had nothing to do with any spell or enchantment. But absurd accusations had destroyed people before. Fear had a way of making the impossible seem plausible, and there were plenty of wolves in the palace who would be all too willing to believe the worst of a girl marked with a silver flame. Thora was already moving, her small frame suddenly seeming larger, more formidable, as she positioned herself between Alina and the guards. She demanded to know who exactly had made this accusation and under what authority the candidates had been summoned. Her voice was sharp, cutting, carrying a note of command that suggested she was far more than just a trainer hidden away in a forgotten courtyard. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. It became clear very quickly that this summons had not come from Kale himself. The Alpha King was apparently occupied with matters of state, meetings with regional pack leaders that had been scheduled for weeks. In his absence, certain members of the court had taken it upon themselves to address what they deemed an urgent concern about the integrity of the Luna selection, which was a polite way of saying that Alina's enemies were making their move while Kale was unavailable to protect her. The auburn-haired woman, who introduced herself breathlessly as Marin's sister Elise, explained that the throne room was already packed with representatives from every major pack. Word of the Alpha King's unprecedented favoritism toward Alina had spread like wildfire through the palace, and now everyone wanted answers. Some were genuinely concerned about the propriety of his actions. Others were simply eager for drama, for the spectacle of watching someone elevated be brought crashing back down. And Cassandra was at the center of it all, weaving her lies with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it her entire life. Alina felt something shift inside her chest, a flicker of the silver flame responding to the rising emotion she was trying desperately to suppress. Thora must have sensed it, because the older woman placed a hand on Alina's shoulder, her grip firm and grounding. "You do not have to go," she said quietly. "They have no actual authority to summon you. You are under the Alpha King's protection. They cannot touch you without his permission." But even as Thora spoke the words, Alina knew they were not entirely true. Yes, she was technically under Kale's protection. Yes, these court members were overstepping their bounds by attempting to hold an unofficial tribunal in his absence. But perception mattered. If Alina refused to face her accusers, if she hid behind the Alpha King's authority and let others fight her battles, the whispers would only grow louder. She would be seen as guilty. She would be seen as weak. She would be seen as exactly what Cassandra was claiming she was, a fraud who had manipulated her way into a position she did not deserve. And after 3 days of learning to tap into her emotions, of breaking down the walls she had built around her anger and her pain and her desperate need to be seen as something other than worthless, Alina found that she could not accept that outcome. She had spent her entire life being accused of things she had not done, being blamed for her mother's death when she had only been trying to save her, being punished for carrying a power she had not asked for, being treated as dangerous and cursed when all she had ever wanted was to be loved. She was done running from accusations. She was done letting others define who she was. If the court wanted answers, she would give them answers. And if Cassandra wanted to play games with lies and manipulation, then Alina would show her exactly what happened when you backed a wolf into a corner, even a wolf that had forgotten how to bite. Alina met Thora's pale eyes and saw understanding flash in their depths. The older woman did not argue, did not try to talk her out of what she was planning. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both approval and warning. "If you do this, you must do it properly," Thora said. "You cannot go before them looking like a victim. You cannot give them any reason to see you as weak or powerless. You must walk into that throne room as what you truly are." "And what am I?" Alina asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Thora smiled, and it was not a kind expression. It was the smile of someone who had survived things that would have destroyed lesser souls, who had walked through fire and emerged stronger for it. "You are the child of the flame," she said simply. "The heir to a bloodline that predates their petty politics and their fragile egos. You are a silver bearer, marked by the moon goddess herself for purposes they cannot begin to comprehend. You are the one the prophecy speaks of, whether you have fully accepted that truth or not." The words settled over Alina like armor. She drew herself up straighter, feeling the silver light respond to the shift in her emotional state. It was not coming to the surface, not yet, but it was there, waiting, a reservoir of power she could draw on if needed. The exhaustion from 3 days of intensive training fell away, replaced by something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. She was going to face her accusers. And she was going to do it on her own terms. The walk from the training courtyard to the throne room felt both endless and far too short. Elise led the way, moving quickly through passages that grew progressively more crowded as they approached the heart of the palace. Word had clearly spread about the impromptu gathering, and it seemed like every wolf within the palace walls had found some excuse to position themselves along the route, eager to catch a glimpse of the girl at the center of the scandal. Alina kept her head high, her shoulders back, her expression carefully neutral. She did not acknowledge the stares or the whispers that followed in her wake. She did not react to the occasional hiss or growl from wolves who had already decided she was guilty of something, even if they were not entirely sure what. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, channeling every lesson Thora had taught her about presence and power and the importance of never letting others see your fear. The throne room was exactly as chaotic as Elise had warned. Every available space was filled with bodies, wolves from a dozen different packs all pressed together in a mass of barely controlled tension. Representatives from the Mountain Claw Pack stood near the eastern wall, their expressions hard and suspicious. Delegates from the Crimson Moon territory occupied the southern section, whispering among themselves with barely concealed excitement. Warriors from the Shadowvale Forest had positioned themselves strategically throughout the room, not quite threatening, but making it clear they were ready to intervene if the situation deteriorated. And standing on the raised platform before the empty throne, looking every inch the wronged innocent, was Cassandra. She had dressed for the occasion, Alina noted with bitter amusement. Gone was the cruel, smirking girl from the Luna selection. In her place stood a picture of wounded dignity, clothed in pale blue silk that almost matched the dress she had torn from Alina's body just days before. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to achieve. Her face was the perfect mask of sorrowful concern, as if she were doing something painful but necessary for the good of the kingdom. Delilah stood beside her, playing the role of supportive sister with practiced ease. And behind them both, just slightly removed from the spotlight, stood Vivian, her expression unreadable but her presence unmistakable. The Step family had come prepared. The crowd noticed Alina's arrival almost immediately. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled wolves like wind across water, turning heads and silencing conversations. Alina felt the weight of hundreds of eyes settling on her, judging, evaluating, looking for any sign of the dark magic that Cassandra had claimed she wielded. She gave them nothing. She simply walked forward, moving through the crowd with calm, deliberate steps, until she stood in the open space before the platform. She did not bow. She did not lower her eyes. She met Cassandra's gaze directly, and something in her stepsister's expression flickered, just for a moment, before the mask of wounded innocence reasserted itself. Cassandra spoke first, her voice carrying across the throne room with the kind of projection that suggested she had rehearsed this speech multiple times. She spoke of her concern for the integrity of the Luna selection, of her duty to the kingdom to ensure that the process remained pure and uncorrupted. She spoke of strange occurrences, of the Alpha King's uncharacteristic behavior, of his sudden and inexplicable favoritism toward a candidate who should never have been allowed to participate in the first place. She did not directly accuse Alina of dark magic, not at first. She was too clever for that. Instead, she planted seeds, asked questions, raised doubts. Was it not strange that the Alpha King had never shown interest in any Luna candidate before Alina appeared? Was it not suspicious that he had known her name without introduction? Was it not concerning that he had draped her in his royal cloak, an honor never before bestowed on anyone? The crowd murmured, uncertainty spreading like infection. Then Cassandra went further. She spoke of Alina's past, of the whispers that had followed her since childhood. She mentioned the night of Alina's mother's death, the destruction that had surrounded the small girl found cradling a corpse. She reminded everyone present that Alina had been deemed too dangerous to participate in normal pack activities, that she had been isolated for good reason. And then, with perfect timing, she asked the question that was designed to condemn. What power does she carry that frightens even her own pack? The throne room erupted. Voices rose from every corner, some defending, most accusing, all demanding answers that Alina had no intention of providing. The representatives from the major packs were calling for an investigation, for tests to determine if dark magic had been used. Others were demanding that Alina be removed from the selection immediately, that she be sent back to her pack or, better yet, expelled from the kingdom entirely. Through it all, Alina remained silent. She stood in the center of the storm, letting it rage around her, waiting for the right moment. Because Thora had taught her something important over the past 3 days. Power was not just about strength or ability. It was about timing, about knowing when to strike and when to hold back, about understanding that sometimes the most devastating response was the one delivered with perfect, calculated calm. The chaos was beginning to reach its peak when the doors at the far end of the throne room slammed open. The sound cut through the noise like a blade through silk, instantly silencing every voice in the room. Every head turned toward the entrance, and Alina felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw who had arrived. Kale. The Alpha King strode into his throne room with the kind of presence that made everyone else seem small by comparison. His golden eyes were blazing with an intensity that suggested he had heard at least some of what had been said, and he was not pleased. The air around him seemed to shimmer with barely restrained power, an aura so strong that the wolves nearest to him actually stepped back without conscious thought. He did not rush. He did not need to. Every step he took commanded absolute attention, absolute submission from everyone present. He moved through the crowd as if they were not there, his gaze fixed on the platform where Cassandra stood frozen, her carefully prepared speech dying on her lips. When Kale reached Alina, he did something that no one in the room had anticipated. He stopped. He turned to face her, his massive frame positioned between her and the assembled court, shielding her from their stares with his own body. And then he did something even more shocking. He bowed his head, just slightly, in a gesture of respect that an Alpha King should never show to anyone who is not his equal. The message was unmistakable. She was under his protection. She was not to be questioned or threatened or accused without going through him first. And anyone who had a problem with that was welcome to challenge him directly. No one was that foolish. Kale's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried effortlessly through the silent throne room. He acknowledged that there had been questions raised about his judgment, about his actions at the Luna selection. He acknowledged that his favoritism toward Alina had been unprecedented and possibly confusing to those who did not understand the full context. But then his tone shifted, hardening into something that carried the full weight of his authority. He made it clear that the Luna selection was his to conduct as he saw fit. That no court member, no matter how well-intentioned, had the authority to question his choices or to summon candidates for interrogation in his absence. That the accusations being thrown around this room were not only baseless, but bordered on treason against his direct orders. And he looked directly at Cassandra as he said the final words. There will be no dark magic investigation. There will be no removal of candidates. The selection will proceed according to my design, and those who cannot accept that are free to leave my court permanently. The threat was barely veiled. Cassandra's face had gone the color of chalk. Delilah looked ready to faint. Even Vivian seemed to have lost some of her careful composure, her eyes darting between Kale and Alina as if trying to calculate how badly she had miscalculated. But Alina was not watching her stepfamily. She was watching the faces of the assembled court, seeing the way they processed what had just happened. Some looked relieved, as if they had been uncomfortable with the accusations from the start and were glad to have the Alpha King shut them down. Others looked resentful, their eyes narrowing as they stared at Alina with barely concealed hostility. These were the dangerous ones. These were the wolves who would not accept Kale's authority on this matter, who would continue to scheme and plot and search for ways to remove Alina from the picture. They might not dare to challenge the Alpha King directly, but they would work in shadows, spreading poison through whispers and manipulation. The battle was not over. It had barely begun. Kale dismissed the court with a gesture, making it clear that the discussion was finished and anyone who lingered would be doing so at their own risk. The throne room began to empty, wolves filing out in clusters, their voices rising again as soon as they thought they were out of the Alpha King's hearing. But Alina knew better. Kale could hear every word, could track every conversation, could identify exactly who was loyal and who was planning their next move against her. She wondered if that was part of his plan. When the room was finally clear, when only Alina and Kale remained standing before the empty throne, he turned to face her fully. His golden eyes searched her face, looking for something she was not sure she understood. "You did not need me to defend you," he said quietly. "You could have handled this yourself." It was not quite a question, but Alina heard the uncertainty beneath the words. He was testing her, trying to understand why she had let him intervene when she clearly had the power to shut down Cassandra's accusations on her own. She considered her answer carefully before responding. "I could have," she said slowly. "But I do not yet know how to wield my power in front of witnesses without terrifying everyone in the room. And while fear might silence my accusers, it would also confirm every dark rumor Cassandra is spreading." Kale's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "So you chose to let me be the shield while you prepare to become the sword." Alina met his burning gaze without flinching. "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice. They were allies now, whether either of them had intended it or not. They were bound together by prophecy and politics and the simple fact that Alina's enemies were gathering forces that she could not yet face alone. But that would change. Alina could feel it in her bones, in the silver light that pulsed beneath her skin in time with her heartbeat. She was not the broken girl who had entered the Luna selection anymore. She was not the victim who had let her stepsisters tear her dress without fighting back. She was becoming something else, something that Cassandra and Vivian and every wolf who had ever underestimated her would learn to fear. She was becoming the storm. And when she finally unleashed the full extent of her power, when she stopped holding back and started fighting for what was hers, the world was going to burn. The nights that followed the confrontation in the throne room were different from anything Alina had experienced before. Kale had made it clear that her training would continue, but he had also made another decision, one that had sent ripples of speculation through the palace. He had announced that Alina would be joining him for evening meals, private dinners held in his personal chambers rather than the grand dining hall where the court assembled each night. It was an honor that had never been extended to any Luna candidate before. It was also, Alina suspected, a deliberate strategy to make her presence in his life seem natural, inevitable, so commonplace that eventually even the most resistant members of his court would have to accept it. But whatever his political motivations might have been, the dinners themselves had become something else entirely. Something neither of them had quite planned for. The first night had been awkward, stilted, filled with the kind of formal conversation that two strangers might engage in when forced to share a meal. They had discussed the weather, the state of the palace gardens, the progress of construction on a new wing that was being added to house visiting dignitaries. Safe topics. Meaningless topics. Words that filled the silence without risking any real connection. Alina had left that first dinner feeling more alone than ever, despite having spent 2 hours in the company of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. But by the third night, something had shifted. Maybe it was the wine, a rich red vintage from the southern territories that loosened tongues and lowered defenses. Maybe it was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that came from spending every day training with Thora and every night navigating the dangerous politics of the palace. Maybe it was simply the fact that they were both tired of pretending to be anything other than what they were. Whatever the reason, the conversation had turned real. Kale had asked her about her childhood, not the parts that everyone already knew or whispered about, but the moments before everything had fallen apart. He had wanted to know about her mother, about the woman who had carried the silver bloodline and passed it down to her daughter. He had wanted to understand what Alina remembered of happiness, of safety, of a time when the world had not yet revealed its cruelty. And Alina against every instinct that screamed at her to protect her vulnerabilities, had told him. She had spoken of summer afternoons in her mother's garden, of learning the names of flowers and herbs that could heal or harm depending on how they were used. She had described the way her mother's voice had sounded when she sang old lullabies, songs in a language that Alina did not recognize, but that had made her feel safe and loved and cherished. She had shared memories of laughter, of her father swinging her up onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowds at pack gatherings, of feeling like she belonged to something larger than herself. The words had poured out of her like water from a broken dam, and once she had started, she could not seem to stop. Cale had listened without interruption, his golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. He had not offered empty platitudes or tried to minimize her pain. He had simply listened, bearing witness to her story, honoring the trust she was placing in him by sharing pieces of herself that she had kept locked away for so long. And when she had finally fallen silent, drained by the emotional weight of remembering, he had done something that surprised her completely. He had shared his own story in return. Cale's childhood had been nothing like Alina's. He had been born into power and expectation, raised from infancy to one day rule the combined packs. But that privilege had come with its own kind of prison. He had never known safety or peace or the simple freedom to be a child. Every moment of his life had been training, preparation, lessons in strategy and combat and politics that had started before he could even shift. His father had been a hard man, more concerned with forging a weapon than raising a son. Affection was weakness. Compassion was liability. The only things that mattered were strength, dominance, the ability to crush any challenger before they could become a genuine threat. Cale had been 10 years old when his father had forced him into his first real fight, a challenge against a grown warrior who had been instructed to show no mercy. The man had broken Cale's ribs, shattered his arm, left him bleeding on the training ground floor. And when it was over, when Cale had finally managed to drag himself to his feet despite the agony screaming through his body, his father had looked down at him with disgust and declared that a true alpha would have won. The scar on Cale's face, the one that ran from beneath his eye to the corner of his mouth, had come from that fight. It had never fully healed. His father had forbidden the healers from erasing it, claiming that it would serve as a reminder of what happened when strength was insufficient. Every time Cale looked in a mirror, he was supposed to remember that he had failed, that he had been weak, that he needed to be harder, colder, more ruthless, if he wanted to survive in a world that showed no mercy to those who hesitated. Cale's voice had been flat and emotionless as he recounted these memories, but Alina had seen the pain beneath the careful control. She had recognized it because it was the same kind of pain she carried, the wounds that time could not heal, the scars that lived deeper than skin. They were both survivors of childhoods that had tried to break them. They had both learned to hide their vulnerabilities behind walls of ice and indifference. They had both spent years believing they had to face the world alone because trusting others only led to betrayal and disappointment. But sitting across from each other in Cale's private chambers, sharing stories they had never told anyone else, something had begun to shift between them. The careful distance they had been maintaining started to feel less like protection and more like cowardice. The walls they had built started to seem less like necessary defenses and more like prisons of their own making. And slowly, cautiously, they began to let those walls come down. Not all at once. Neither of them was that brave or that foolish. But in increments, in small revelations shared over meals that stretched long into the night, they started to show each other the truth of who they were beneath the roles they played for the rest of the world. Alina learned that Cale was not the cold, merciless king that his reputation suggested. He carried the weight of every decision he made, felt genuine pain when his choices resulted in suffering even when those choices were necessary. He spent sleepless nights worrying about threats to his people, running through scenarios and contingencies, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of dangers that seemed to multiply every day. He was lonely in a way that Alina understood intimately, surrounded by people who wanted things from him but never truly saw him. And Kale learned that Alina was not the broken, powerless victim that her circumstances might suggest. Beneath the scars left by years of abuse was a core of steel that had refused to be destroyed no matter how hard her stepfamily had tried. She had survived things that would have shattered most wolves, and she had emerged with her capacity for hope and compassion somehow intact. She was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and far more dangerous than anyone who had underestimated her would ever live to realize. The night everything truly changed started like all the others. Alina arrived at Kale's chambers as the sun was setting, painting the sky outside his windows in shades of orange and deep purple. The meal had already been laid out, though neither of them had much appetite these days. They picked at the food more out of habit than hunger, their attention focused on each other rather than the elaborate dishes prepared by the palace kitchens. They talked about Alina's training progress. Thora had pronounced herself cautiously impressed, which from the stern old woman was the equivalent of ecstatic praise. Alina could now call the silver flame reliably, could maintain it for extended periods without exhaustion, could shape it into forms that ranged from protective shields to focus beams of destructive energy. But there was still so much she did not know, so much she had not yet mastered. Kale listened as she described her frustrations, the way the power seemed to have a will of its own, responding to her emotions in ways that were not always helpful or appropriate. Just that morning, she had accidentally scorched an entire section of the training courtyard when a particularly painful memory had surfaced during meditation. His expression had shifted into something thoughtful as she spoke. "There is something I want to show you," he said when she finished. "Something that might help you understand what you are carrying." Alina felt curiosity spark despite her exhaustion. Kale did not make casual offers. If he thought something was worth showing her, it was probably important. He led her through his chambers to a door she had not noticed before, one that blended so seamlessly with the wood paneling of the walls that it was nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Beyond it lay a staircase that spiraled upward, narrow and steep, clearly designed for private access rather than public use. They climbed in silence, emerging eventually onto the roof of the palace. The view stole Alina's breath completely. From this height, she could see the entire capital spread out below them, a tapestry of lights and shadows as the city transitioned from day to night. Beyond the city walls, the wild lands stretched to the horizon, dark forests and rolling hills and distant mountains that had stood unchanged since before the first wolves learned to walk on two legs. The full moon was rising in the east, huge and luminous, painting everything in silver light. Kale had chosen this moment deliberately. He gestured for Alina to join him at the edge of the roof, where a low wall provided some protection from the drop below. The wind was stronger up here, carrying with it the sense of the forest and the night, and something wilder that made Alina's wolf stir with longing. "Do you know why the silver flame responds to the moon?" Kale asked, his voice pitched low beneath the sound of the wind. Alina shook her head. It was one of the many gaps in her knowledge, something that Thora had mentioned in passing but never fully explained. Kale turned to look at her, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight in a way that made them seem almost luminous. "Because the moon is alive," he said simply. "Not in the way that we understand life, but in a way that predates our understanding. The moon goddess is not a metaphor or a symbol. She is real. She is watching. And the silver flame is her direct gift to those she has chosen to serve as her hands in this world." The words should have sounded insane. They should have been dismissed as fantasy or delusion. But standing on the roof of the palace with the full moon rising before them, Alina could not bring herself to doubt. Because she could feel it. The silver light inside her was responding to the moon's presence, growing stronger, brighter, more insistent. It was not random emotion triggering the power this time. It was something else entirely, a call from something vast and ancient and utterly beyond human comprehension. The moon was speaking to her, and the silver flame was answering. Kale must have seen the change in her expression, because he moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hand found hers, his fingers threading through her own in a gesture that was both grounding and electrifying. "Let it out," he said softly. "Stop fighting it. Stop controlling it. Just let the power do what it wants to do." Alina wanted to refuse. Every instinct she had developed over years of suppression was screaming at her to keep the power contained, to not risk losing control, to protect herself and everyone around her from what might happen if the silver flame was truly unleashed. But Kale's hand in hers was steady and warm and somehow made her feel safe in a way nothing else ever had. So she stopped fighting. She stopped trying to control the power, stopped trying to shape it or direct it or force it into the forms that Thora had been teaching her. She simply opened herself to it, accepting it fully for the first time since her mother had died, allowing it to flow through her without restriction or fear. The silver light erupted from her body in a wave of brilliance that turned the night into day. It poured from her skin like liquid starlight, cascading down her arms and legs, pooling at her feet before rising up again in spirals that danced in the air around her. The light was warm, not burning, carrying with it a sense of peace and rightness that Alina had never experienced before. This was what the power was meant to be. Not a weapon. Not a curse. Not something to be hidden or feared or used only in moments of desperate need. It was a gift. A connection to something sacred. A reminder that she was part of something far larger and more beautiful than the small, painful world she had been trapped in for so long. The silver light spread outward from where Alina stood, flowing across the roof of the palace, spilling over the edges to cascade down the walls. It illuminated the entire structure, turning the ancient stone into something that looked like it had been carved from moonlight itself. From the city below came sounds of wonder and alarm as people noticed the impossible radiance emanating from the palace. But Alina was not concerned with their reactions. She was lost in the sensation of the power moving through her, of the moon's presence filling her awareness, of a voice that was not quite words speaking directly to her soul. "Child of the flame, daughter of the silver light, you have been called. You have been chosen. You have been prepared for this moment since before your birth. The enemies that were defeated in ages past are stirring once more. The darkness that was sealed away is breaking free of its bonds. The time of testing is upon the wolf packs, and they will need a champion who can stand against what is coming. You are that champion. You are the bridge between the old magic and the new world. You are the sword that will cut through shadow. You are the light that will guide your people through the darkness ahead. But you cannot do this alone. You will need allies. You will need strength beyond your own. You will need the bond that has been forged between you and the one who stands at your side, the Alpha King whose soul is tied to yours by threads that were woven before either of you drew breath. Trust him. Let him trust you. Together, you are greater than the sum of your parts. Together, you can face what no single wolf could survive." The vision that had come with the voice faded slowly, leaving Alina standing on the roof with the silver light still cascading around her. But something had changed. The power was no longer simply flowing out of her in random patterns. It was responding to her will, shaping itself according to her thoughts, creating forms and structures that existed somewhere between the physical and the spiritual. She could see it now, the way the silver flame was meant to be used. Not as a blunt instrument of destruction, but as a tool of incredible precision and versatility. She could heal with it, restore life to things that were dying. She could protect with it, create shields that would turn aside any attack. She could illuminate truth with it, burning away lies and deceptions to reveal what was hidden. And yes, when necessary, she could destroy with it, channeling the full might of the moon's fury against threats that could not be reasoned with or redeemed. The power was limitless in its potential. The only question was whether Alina would prove worthy of wielding it. She turned to look at Kale, who had stood silent throughout her entire communion with the moon goddess. His golden eyes were wide with something that might have been awe, his expression stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. He was seeing her as she truly was for the first time, not the broken girl from the Luna selection, not the victim of her stepfamily's cruelty, but the being she was meant to become. The child of the flame. The silver bearer. His destined mate. The last thought should have terrified Alina. Accepting that they were meant to be together, that their souls were bound by forces beyond their control or understanding, should have felt like losing her freedom, like surrendering her autonomy to a destiny she had not chosen. But standing there in the moonlight with the silver flame still dancing around them both, it did not feel like surrender. It felt like coming home. Kale moved toward her, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. The silver light parted around him like water around stone, acknowledging his presence, welcoming him into the sacred space it had created. When he stood directly before her, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face, he lifted his hand and touched her cheek with the same gentleness he had shown in the sacred chamber days before. "I see you," he said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken that first night. "All of you. The power you carry. The pain you have survived. The strength you do not yet know you possess. I see you, Alina. And I am not afraid." The words broke something inside her, some final wall she had been clinging to, the last defense that had kept her from accepting what was happening between them. She was falling in love with him. Or maybe she already had fallen, days ago, weeks ago, in that first moment when he had draped his cloak over her shoulders and spoken her name as though it were something precious. Maybe the bond between them had been awakening slowly all this time, growing stronger with every shared meal and every honest conversation and every moment when they had chosen to trust each other despite the risks. The realization should have been overwhelming. But instead, it felt inevitable. Right. True. Alina reached up and covered Kale's hand with her own, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. The silver light responded to the contact, flowing from her skin to his, creating a connection between them that went beyond the physical. She could feel his emotions now, not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences. His loneliness. His fear that he would fail his people. His desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found someone who could stand beside him as an equal rather than a subordinate or a supplicant. And he could feel hers in return. Her terror that she would not be strong enough when the time came. Her aching need to be valued for who she was rather than what she could do. Her growing certainty that whatever happened, whatever challenges they faced, she wanted to face them with him. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, trembling on the edge of something that could not be taken back once it was done. Kale leaned closer, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Alina gave him none. She rose up on her toes, closing the final distance between them, and kissed him. It was not like anything she had ever imagined a first kiss would be. There was no awkwardness, no fumbling uncertainty. Their mouths met as if they had been doing this for years, as if they knew instinctively how to move together, how to fit together, how to turn this single point of contact into something that felt like completeness. The silver light exploded around them in response to the kiss, cascading outward in waves of brilliance that lit up the entire sky. And somewhere deep inside Alina, something that had been missing her entire life finally clicked into place. The mate bond. She could feel it now, the golden thread that connected her soul to Kale's, the bond that had been forming since the moment they first saw each other, but had needed this moment of acceptance to fully manifest. It was not a chain or a prison. It was a bridge, a connection that made them both stronger, that would allow them to share power and strength and support when either of them needed it. They were bound now, in a way that could not be easily broken. And Alina found that she did not want it to be broken. Not now. Not ever. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Kale rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, his expression one of profound relief and equally profound joy. "You are mine," he whispered. "And I am yours. From this moment forward, in this life and whatever comes after, we are bound together." Alina smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes," she agreed softly. "We are." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by silver light that slowly faded as the moon continued its journey across the sky. The city below had fallen silent, everyone who had witnessed the impossible display of power trying to make sense of what they had seen. Tomorrow would bring questions, accusations, demands for explanations. But tonight, in this moment, none of that mattered. Tonight, Alina had found something she had been searching for her entire life without knowing it. She had found someone who saw her completely and loved her anyway. She had found her mate. And together, they were going to change the world. Whether the world was ready for it or not. The morning after the moonlight ritual brought a reckoning that Alina should have anticipated, but had allowed herself to forget in the warmth of Kale's arms. She woke alone in her chambers, the other side of the bed cold despite the fact that Kale had stayed with her until just before dawn. He had duties that could not be postponed, meetings with regional alphas who had been demanding his attention for weeks. But he had promised to return before nightfall, had kissed her with a tenderness that still made her skin tingle at the memory, had looked at her with eyes that held nothing but certainty and claim. The mate bond hummed between them even now, a golden thread that she could feel connecting her heart to his no matter the physical distance that separated them. It was warm and constant, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that someone in this vast and hostile world had chosen to stand beside her. But that warmth could not protect her from what was waiting outside her door. Marin arrived with breakfast and a face that spoke of terrible news held barely in check. The servant's hands trembled as she set down the tray, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. When Alina pressed her for information, the words came tumbling out in a breathless rush. The court was in chaos. The display of power last night, the silver light that had illuminated the entire palace and half the capital city, had shattered any remaining illusion that Alina was simply another Luna candidate. Everyone knew now that she carried something ancient and powerful, something that went far beyond the abilities of an ordinary wolf. And the reactions to that knowledge were as varied as they were violent. Some of the pack representatives were calling for her immediate coronation as Luna, declaring that the moon goddess herself had clearly marked her as the Alpha King's chosen mate. Others were demanding her arrest and trial, insisting that no one with that much unchecked power should be allowed to remain in the palace. A few of the more extreme voices were even suggesting execution, arguing that history had proven silver bearers too dangerous to live. But the most damaging voices were the ones speaking in quiet corners, planting seeds of doubt about Kale himself. How could the Alpha King, who had ruled with such strength and wisdom for over a decade, suddenly be so blind to the danger Alina represented? What hold did she have over him that he would risk his entire kingdom for a girl marked by cursed power? Was this truly the will of the moon goddess, or had Kale been compromised in ways that made him unfit to lead? The whispers of a coup were still faint, barely more than hints and implications. But they were there, growing louder with each hour that passed, fed by fear and ambition and the opportunism of wolves who had been waiting for any sign of weakness to exploit. Alina listened to Marin's report with a sinking feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. She had been naive to think that the mate bond would solve everything, that public acceptance of her power would somehow make the political complications disappear. If anything, the display had made everything worse, had accelerated a conflict that might have been manageable if it had been allowed to develop more slowly. She had painted a target on both their backs. And the arrows were already flying. Marin had barely finished speaking when the summons came. Not a polite request delivered by a servant, but a formal decree issued by the Council of Elders, the body of senior wolves who technically advised the Alpha King, but in practice wielded considerable power of their own. Alina was to appear before them within the hour to answer questions about her bloodline, her abilities, and her intentions regarding the throne. The wording was carefully neutral, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. They were putting her on trial. Alina dressed with hands that wanted to shake, but that she forced to remain steady. She chose a simple gown in deep midnight blue, elegant but not ostentatious, a compromise between the humility they would expect and the dignity she refused to surrender. Marin helped her arrange her hair in a style that was both practical and beautiful, pulling it back from her face to reveal features that had lost the haunted look they had carried for so long. She looked like someone who belonged in a palace. She looked like someone who could stand before a council of powerful wolves and refuse to be intimidated. She looked like a queen, even if the crown had not yet been placed on her head. The walk to the council chambers felt longer than it should have, even though they were only a few corridors away from her rooms. Guards flanked her on either side, their expressions carefully blank, their presence a reminder that she was not simply being invited to a conversation. She was being escorted, controlled, contained. The council chambers were located in one of the oldest parts of the palace, a section that predated even Kale's grandfather's reign. The stones here were rougher, darker, carrying the weight of centuries of decisions both wise and catastrophic. The doors were massive slabs of ironwood bound with steel, designed to withstand siege, and they opened with a groan that sounded almost like a warning. Inside, 12 wolves sat in a semicircle on raised seats that looked down upon a single chair positioned in the center of the room. The chair was simple, unadorned, deliberately designed to make whoever sat in it feel small and exposed. It was the seat reserved for those being judged, and it had seen its share of wolves who had entered the chamber with confidence and left broken or not at all. Alina recognized some of the council members from the Luna selection and the confrontation in the throne room. Marcus Blackthorn, alpha of the Mountain Claw Pack, sat at the far left, his broad shoulders and scarred face radiating barely contained hostility. Vivian Ashford, representative of the Crimson Moon Territory, occupied the center position, her silver hair arranged in elaborate braids and her eyes sharp with calculation. Others she knew only by reputation, ancient wolves who had served on the council for decades, wielding influence that rivaled even the Alpha Kings in certain matters. And standing in the shadows behind the council seats, barely visible in the dim torchlight, was a figure Alina had not expected to see. Vivian. Her stepmother had somehow secured a place at this proceeding, though whether as witness or accuser remained to be seen. The older woman's face was carefully composed, revealing nothing of her thoughts, but Alina could sense the satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a forge. This was what Vivian had been waiting for. This was her chance to destroy Alina once and for all, using the very power that she had spent years forcing Alina to hide as the weapon of her stepdaughter's destruction. Alina took her seat in the center of the room without being asked. She would not wait for their permission, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate or show fear. She sat with her back straight and her head high, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn, refusing to lower her gaze even when the pressure of their combined dominance pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight. Marcus Blackthorn spoke first, his voice a deep rumble that filled the chamber. He wasted no time on formalities or pleasantries. He stated plainly that the council had convened this emergency session to address a matter of grave concern to the stability of the kingdom. The appearance of a silver bearer, a wolf carrying powers that had been thought extinct for generations, raised questions that demanded immediate answers. Who was Alina really? Where had she come from? What was the true extent of her abilities? And most importantly, what were her intentions toward the Alpha King and the throne he occupied? The questions were designed to trap her, to force her into either claiming power that would make her seem like a threat or denying it in ways that would make her appear weak and unworthy of the Alpha King's favor. Alina chose a third path. She told the truth. She spoke of her mother, of the silver bloodline that had been passed down through generations in secret, hidden from those who would destroy it. She acknowledged that she carried the silver flame, that she had been born with a power she had not asked for and had spent years trying to suppress out of fear and ignorance. She admitted that she did not yet fully understand what she was capable of, that she was still learning to control abilities that were as dangerous as they were potentially beneficial. And she stated clearly, without apology or qualification, that she was the Alpha King's mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself, bound to him by ties that went deeper than politics or personal preference. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Voices rose from every direction, overlapping and competing in a cacophony of shock and outrage and disbelief. Some council members were demanding proof of her claims about the mate bond. Others were insisting that the moon goddess would never choose someone with cursed blood. A few were calling for immediate separation, arguing that Kale needed to reject the bond before it could be fully established, before Alina's taint could spread to him. Through it all, Alina remained silent, letting them exhaust themselves, waiting for the storm to pass. It was Vivian Ashford who finally restored order, her voice cutting through the noise with the kind of authority that came from decades of political maneuvering. When the chamber had quieted, she turned her sharp gaze on Alina and asked the question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had dared to voice. How do we know you have not enchanted him? How do we know this mate bond you claim is genuine and not some dark magic you have used to compromise our king's judgment? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Alina felt the mate bond flare in response to the insult, felt Kale's rage bleeding through the connection even though he was physically distant. He had heard, somehow, or felt through the bond what was happening. And he was coming. But he would not arrive in time. Alina needed to defend herself now, needed to answer this challenge in a way that would satisfy the council, or at least prevent them from taking immediate action against her. She stood, rising from the chair of judgment with fluid grace, and let the silver light begin to glow beneath her skin. Not threatening, not aggressive, but undeniable. A visible manifestation of the power they all feared. When she spoke, her voice carried a resonance that had not been there before, as if the moon goddess herself was speaking through her chosen vessel. She explained that the mate bond could not be faked or manufactured through any magic, dark or otherwise. It was a gift from the moon goddess, bestowed only on those she deemed worthy, connecting souls that were meant to walk through life together. The bond was sacred, recognized by every wolf pack across the realm, honored in their oldest traditions and their most fundamental laws. To question the validity of a mate bond was to question the moon goddess herself. The words were a gamble, invoking religious authority that could either strengthen her position or make her seem blasphemous and delusional. Vivian's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Then prove it," she said coldly. "Prove that this bond you claim is real and not simply your own delusion or deception." Alina felt her heart skip a beat. There were ways to prove a mate bond, rituals that had been used in the past when questions of succession or legitimacy demanded verification. But they were dangerous, requiring both parties to open themselves completely to magical examination, exposing not just the bond but every secret, every vulnerability, every hidden truth they carried. If she agreed to the ritual and it revealed anything that the council could use against her or against Kale, they would be destroyed. But if she refused, she would appear guilty, and the council would almost certainly vote to separate her from Kale by force. Before Alina could formulate a response, the doors to the chamber slammed open with enough force to crack the ancient ironwood. Kale strode into the room like a storm-given form, his golden eyes blazing with a fury that made even the most powerful council members shrink back in their seats. The air around him shimmered with barely contained power, an aura of dominance so intense that several of the younger wolves in the room actually whimpered and lowered their heads in automatic submission. He did not stop to acknowledge the council or offer explanations for his interruption. He moved directly to Alina, positioning himself between her and the judging gazes of the 12 wolves who had dared to put his mate on trial without his permission or presence. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried effortlessly through the suddenly silent chamber. He made it clear that this proceeding was over, that the council had no authority to question his mate or demand proof of a bond that was none of their concern. That Alina was under his direct protection, and any further attempts to interrogate or threaten her would be considered an act of rebellion against his authority. Marcus Blackthorne was the first to recover from the shock of the Alpha King's entrance. He rose from his seat, his considerable bulk seeming to fill half the chamber, and spoke with a defiance that bordered on challenge. "We have a right to question matters that affect the stability of the kingdom. The appearance of a silver bearer, the claiming of a mate without consultation with the council, these are not personal matters. They are political decisions that impact every pack under your rule." Kale turned to face the large wolf, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I do not need the council's permission to claim my mate," he said, each word falling like stones into still water. "The mate bond is granted by the moon goddess. It is not subject to political approval or democratic vote. Alina is mine. I am hers. That is the only truth that matters." "But what if she is dangerous?" Vivian interjected, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than confrontational. "What if the power she carries is unstable? What if history repeats itself and the silver flame consumes everything it touches?" "Then I will stand beside her and face those consequences," Kale responded without hesitation. "But I will not abandon my mate because of fears based on events that happened centuries ago. I will not condemn her for carrying a gift from the goddess herself." The council members exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them that Alina could not interpret. Something was happening, some shift in the dynamic that went beyond the immediate confrontation. And then Vivian stepped forward from the shadows. Alina's stepmother moved with careful deliberation, positioning herself where the council could see her clearly. When she spoke, her voice was pitched to carry sympathy and reluctance, as if every word pained her to say. She claimed to have information that the council needed to hear. Information about Alina's past that was relevant to the current situation. She spoke of the night Alina's mother had died, of the destruction that had surrounded the child, of the suspicions that had never been fully investigated because Marcus, Alina's father, had protected his daughter from scrutiny. But Marcus was dead now, Vivian said with false sorrow. And the truth could no longer be suppressed. Alina felt ice flood her veins as she realized what her stepmother was about to do. Vivian produced a document, yellowed with age but carefully preserved, bearing the seal of the Silver Ridge Pack's former alpha. It was a report, she explained, written by one of the healers who had examined Alina's mother's body after her death. A report that had been buried at Marcus's insistence, but that Vivian had discovered among her late husband's papers. The report stated clearly that Alina's mother had not died of natural illness. She had died from having her life force drained, her very essence consumed by something that had fed on her from within. And the only other person in the room at the time of death had been Alina herself. The implication was clear and devastating. Alina had killed her own mother, had used the silver flame to consume the woman who had given her life, either through malice or through inability to control her power. The council chamber exploded into chaos for the second time, but this chaos was different, darker, fueled by genuine horror rather than simple political maneuvering. Wolves were rising from their seats, hands moving to weapons that should not have been brought into the council chambers, but clearly had been. The guards who had escorted Alina were stepping forward, no longer protective but threatening. Alina could not breathe, could not think, could not process what was happening. The report was a lie. It had to be a lie. She had not killed her mother. She had been trying to save her, had been reaching out with the only power she had, desperate to heal the woman who was slipping away despite the efforts of every healer in the pack. But the silver flame had erupted anyway, had poured out of her in waves, and her mother had died in that same moment. Had she done it? Had her untrained, uncontrolled power actually drained her mother's life instead of healing her? The doubt was a knife twisting in her chest. Cale was speaking, his voice rising above the chaos, demanding that the document be examined for authenticity, insisting that Vivian was lying, that this was a political attack designed to discredit Alina. But even he could not completely hide the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face, the brief moment when he looked at Alina and wondered if there was truth hidden in the accusation. That look, that single instant of doubt, shattered something inside Alina more completely than any beating or locked cellar ever had. He did not fully trust her. Even with the mate bond connecting them, even after everything they had shared, there was still a part of him that wondered if she was dangerous, if she was cursed, if loving her was a mistake that would cost him everything. The silver flame inside Alina responded to her emotional devastation, surging upward with a violence that she could not contain. It wanted out. It wanted to burn away everyone who had ever hurt her, everyone who had ever looked at her with suspicion and fear, everyone who had decided she was guilty before giving her a chance to defend herself. It wanted to prove them all right. Alina felt control slipping away from her, felt the careful lessons Thora had taught dissolving in the face of pain too profound to be endured. The silver light was beginning to leak through her skin, brighter and hotter than it had ever been before, responding not to her will but to the primal scream of a soul that had been wounded one time too many. She was going to lose control. She was going to fulfill every terrible prophecy they had ever made about silver bearers. She was going to become the monster they all believed her to be. And in that moment of absolute despair, standing in the council chamber with accusations raining down around her and doubt clouding even her mate's eyes, Alina made a choice. She ran. The silver light exploded outward in a blinding flash that sent every wolf in the chamber staggering backward, hands raised to protect their eyes. In the confusion, Alina bolted for the door, moving with speed born of desperation and years of practice at escaping dangerous situations. She heard Cale shouting her name, felt him reaching for her through the mate bond, trying to stop her or comfort her or explain something she could not bear to hear. But she did not stop. She ran through corridors that blurred together, down staircases that seemed to multiply beneath her feet, through passages she had never seen before, but that her instincts guided her toward anyway. The silver light was still pouring from her body, leaving a trail of brilliance in her wake, setting off alarm bells throughout the palace as guards noticed the impossible radiance. She ran until she reached the palace walls, until she stood before a gate that should have been locked, but that opened at her touch as if the metal itself recognized what she was and chose to let her pass. She ran into the wild lands beyond the city, into forests that had stood unchanged for millennia, into darkness that welcomed her like an old friend. And behind her, in the palace she had briefly dared to call home, chaos reigned. The council was demanding immediate action. Vivian was calling for a hunting party to track down the dangerous creature that had just fled. Some wolves were insisting that Alina's flight was proof of her guilt, that an innocent person would have stayed to defend herself. And Cale stood in the center of it all, staring at the door through which his mate had disappeared, feeling the mate bond stretch and strain as she put distance between them. He had hesitated. For just one moment, confronted with evidence that might prove Alina had killed her own mother, he had allowed doubt to enter his mind. And she had seen it. She had seen the uncertainty in his eyes, and it had broken her. Now she was gone, running into a wilderness that was no longer safe, pursued by wolves who saw her as a threat to be eliminated rather than a person to be protected. The silver flame inside her was out of control, making her a beacon that every enemy within 100 miles would be able to track. And the darkness that the prophecy had warned about, the ancient enemy that had been gathering strength in the shadows, would certainly sense her power and come looking. Cale had lost her. And if he did not find her soon, if he could not convince her to come back, to trust him again despite his moment of weakness, the kingdom would lose far more than just a potential Luna. They would lose the only weapon that could save them from the war that was coming. The mate bond pulsed in his chest, still connected but growing fainter with every moment that passed. Cale made his decision in an instant. He shifted, his wolf form erupting from his human shape in a transformation so fast it left the watching council members gasping. His wolf was massive, larger than any natural animal, with fur that shimmered with golden light that matched his eyes. And without a word to the council or the guards or anyone else who might have tried to stop him, the Alpha King abandoned his throne and ran after his mate. Into the wild lands. Into the darkness. Into whatever waited in the shadows, ready to destroy everything they had been building. The hunt had begun. And nothing would ever be the same again. The forest swallowed Alina whole. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out beneath her, until the palace was nothing more than a distant glow on the horizon behind her, until the sounds of civilization faded into the primal symphony of the wild lands. The trees here were ancient, their trunks so wide that 3 wolves standing side by side could not have encircled them, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers clawing at the stars. This was old territory, the kind of forest that existed before the packs had claimed their boundaries and built their cities, before wolves had learned to walk on 2 legs and pretend they were anything other than creatures of tooth and claw and instinct. This was where the wild things still lived. And Alina was now one of them. The silver light continued to pour from her body despite her desperate attempts to contain it, illuminating the darkness around her in pulses that matched her frantic heartbeat. Every tree she passed was bathed in that impossible radiance, every stone and root and fallen branch made visible by the power she could no longer control. She was a beacon in the darkness, announcing her presence to everything within miles. Prey. The thought came from somewhere deep in her consciousness, from the part of her that understood predator and prey dynamics within clarity that her human mind tried to reject. She was injured, alone, out of control, radiating power that would attract attention from things far more dangerous than angry council members or betrayed stepfamilies. She needed to stop running, needed to find shelter, needed to regain control before something found her that she could not fight. But her body would not obey. The pain was too great, the sense of betrayal too raw, the feeling of being utterly and completely alone too overwhelming to allow rational thought to take hold. She had allowed herself to hope, had permitted herself to believe that maybe this time would be different, that maybe Cale truly saw her and accepted her and would stand beside her no matter what accusations were thrown in her direction. But he had hesitated. That single moment of doubt had confirmed every terrible thing Alina had ever believed about herself. She was cursed. She was dangerous. She was a monster wearing a girl's face, and eventually everyone who got close to her would realize it and turn away. Even her mate. Especially her mate. The mate bond was still there, stretched thin but unbroken, a golden thread connecting her heart to Cale's across the growing distance. She could feel him through it, could sense his panic and his determination and his desperate need to reach her. He was coming after her, she realized with a jolt that was equal parts relief and terror. He was hunting her. And the Alpha King, when he hunted, always caught his prey. Alina pushed herself harder, ignoring the protests of muscles pushed beyond their limits, ignoring the branches that tore at her skin and the roots that threatened to trip her with every step. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the palace and the wolves who wanted to see her destroyed. She ran until she could run no more. The collapse came without warning. One moment she was moving, the next her legs simply gave out, sending her crashing to the forest floor in a tangle of limbs and torn fabric. The impact drove the air from her lungs, left her gasping and dizzy and too exhausted to even contemplate standing again. The silver light flickered, dimming slightly as her consciousness began to blur at the edges. She was going to pass out here, alone in the darkness, vulnerable to whatever found her first. Part of her did not care. Part of her welcomed the oblivion that unconsciousness promised, the temporary escape from pain and fear and the crushing weight of disappointment that sat on her chest like a physical thing. But another part of her, the part that had survived years of abuse and isolation and systematic attempts to break her spirit, refused to surrender. Not like this. Not when she had come so far. Not when she finally understood what she was capable of becoming. Alina forced herself to breathe, to pull air into her starving lungs in slow, deliberate pulls. She closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for the silver flame that was raging out of control, trying to find the center of the storm so she could calm it. Thora's voice echoed in her memory, lessons delivered over days of intensive training that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The power responds to truth, the old woman had said. To emotion, yes, but specifically to honest emotion. When you are lying to yourself, when you are denying what you really feel, the silver flame becomes unstable. But when you face the truth, no matter how painful, you can control it. What was the truth? Alina lay on the forest floor, her body aching and her heart shattered, and forced herself to examine the raw wound at the center of her being. The truth was that she had killed her mother. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but the silver flame had erupted from her that night, untrained and uncontrolled, and it had drained her mother's life force just as Vivian's falsified report had claimed. Alina had been trying to heal, but she had not known how to direct the power, had not understood what she was doing, and so the flame had taken what it needed from the only source available. Her mother's dying body. The guilt she had been carrying for 8 years was not misplaced. It was earned. Deserved. A weight she would carry for the rest of her life, because it was the truth of what she had done. But there was another truth buried beneath that guilt. Her mother had known what was happening. In those final moments, when the silver light had erupted and the life had begun to drain from her body, Alina's mother had smiled. She had touched Alina's cheek with trembling fingers and spoken words that Alina had spent years trying to forget. You carry it. The flame. My beautiful girl. You carry it. Not an accusation. Not fear. Not horror at being killed by her own daughter. Understanding. Acceptance. Even joy. Because Alina's mother had been a silver bearer too, had carried the power in her own blood even if it had never manifested as strongly as it did in her daughter. She had known what the silver flame was, what it meant, what Alina would become. And in her final moments, feeling her life being pulled away by the very power she had passed down through her bloodline, she had chosen to let it happen. She had given her life willingly so that the silver flame could fully awaken in Alina. She had sacrificed herself to ensure that the child of the flame would have the strength needed to face what was coming. The realization hit Alina like a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had managed to recover. Her mother had not been a victim. She had been the first person to truly see what Alina was and to believe in her potential enough to give everything so that potential could be realized. The silver light inside Alina shifted in response to this truth, the chaotic storm beginning to organize itself into something more controlled, more purposeful. It was still powerful, still vast enough to be terrifying, but it was no longer fighting against her. It was waiting for her direction, ready to be shaped according to her will now that she had finally faced the truth of where it came from. Alina pushed herself up from the forest floor, her body protesting but obeying, and she sat with her back against one of the massive tree trunks. She could feel the mate bond more clearly now, could sense Kale getting closer with every passing moment. He would find her soon, would try to explain or apologize or convince her to return to the palace. But she was not ready to face him yet. She needed to understand what she was first, needed to claim her power fully before she could even begin to address the question of whether she could trust him again. So she did what Thora had been training her to do. She stopped fighting the silver flame and instead opened herself to it completely. The power rose up from the depths of her being like a tide, filling every corner of her consciousness, flowing through channels in her body that she had not known existed. It was vast, so much larger than she had realized, an ocean of potential that went far beyond the simple offensive and defensive techniques she had been practicing in the training courtyard. The silver flame was life itself. It could create or destroy with equal ease, could heal mortal wounds or inflict them, could illuminate truth or burn away lies. It was the power of the moon goddess made manifest in the mortal realm, and Alina was the vessel chosen to wield it in this generation. With that understanding came knowledge. Not learned or taught, but simply known, as if the information had always been waiting inside her, and only now could she access it. She understood now how the ancient silver bearers had used their gifts, the techniques and disciplines they had developed over millennia of practice. She could see the patterns of energy that flowed through all living things, could sense the connections that bound the world together in ways that ordinary wolves would never perceive. And she could feel the darkness that was gathering on the edges of the realm. It was distant still, but growing closer, a presence so vast and so utterly antithetical to life that even sensing it from this distance made her soul recoil in horror. This was what the prophecy had warned about, the enemy that had been defeated in ages past, but never truly destroyed, only sealed away in places between worlds where it could do no harm. Those seals were breaking. The darkness was returning. And when it arrived in full force, it would consume everything in its path unless someone could stand against it with power equal to its hunger. Alina understood now why the moon goddess had chosen her, had allowed her to be born into suffering and abuse and isolation. Every hardship she had endured had been forging her into a weapon capable of wielding the silver flame without being destroyed by it. Every moment of pain had been teaching her to endure what ordinary wolves would have broken under. Every betrayal had been showing her that she could survive alone if necessary, that she did not need anyone else's approval or acceptance to be worthy of the power she carried. She had been shaped by suffering into exactly what the world needed her to be: a survivor, a fighter, a force of nature that could not be contained or controlled or destroyed by anything less than the darkness itself. The silver light exploded outward from where Alina sat, no longer wild and chaotic, but controlled, purposeful, shaped by will and understanding into a manifestation of pure power. It rose up from her body in a column of brilliance that pierced the forest canopy and reached toward the moon above, a beacon visible for miles in every direction. And Alina, sitting at the center of that impossible radiance, opened her eyes. They were no longer the violet they had been since birth. They burned with pure silver light, reflecting the power that now flowed freely through every cell of her body. She stood, and the forest itself seemed to bow before her. Trees bent away from the light. Stones cracked and reformed. The very air shimmered with energy that rewrote the laws of nature in the space around her. This was not destruction. It was transformation. The silver flame was remaking the world according to a pattern that existed before the current reality had been established, revealing what had always been hidden beneath the surface. Alina raised her hand and watched as silver fire danced along her fingers, beautiful and terrible and utterly responsive to her will. She was not afraid anymore. Not of her power. Not of the darkness that was coming. Not even of the pain that loving Kale might bring if he truly could not accept what she was. She was the child of the flame. She was the silver bearer. And she was done being a victim. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through her concentration, multiple sets moving through the forest with the kind of coordination that spoke of trained warriors rather than random wanderers. Alina turned toward the sound, the silver light intensifying in response to potential threat, and she saw them emerging from the darkness between the trees. Wolves. But not Kale's wolves. These creatures wore forms that were twisted, corrupted, their fur matted with substances that looked like oil and shadow mixed together. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green luminescence that had nothing to do with natural wolf biology. And the scent that preceded them was wrong, carrying notes of decay and wrongness that made Alina's stomach turn. Shadow beasts. The servants of the darkness, creatures that had been corrupted by prolonged exposure to the ancient enemy's influence. They should not have been this far into the kingdom's territory, should not have been able to penetrate the wards and patrols that protected the borders. Unless those defenses were already failing. Unless the darkness was closer than anyone realized. The shadow beasts spread out in a semicircle, cutting off escape routes, moving with the kind of intelligence that suggested they were being directed by something more sophisticated than simple animal instinct. They were hunting her specifically, Alina realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. They had sensed her power and come to either claim it or destroy it before it could become a threat to their master. There were 12 of them, each one massive and clearly experienced in combat, their bodies bearing scars that spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. Against an ordinary wolf, even an ordinary alpha, they would have been overwhelming. But Alina was not ordinary. She let the silver flame build in her hands, shaping it into forms that responded to intent rather than physical laws. Blades of pure light formed along her arms, extending from her fingertips like claws that could cut through anything that existed in the physical realm. A shield manifested around her body, translucent silver that would turn aside any attack that managed to get close. And behind her eyes, her consciousness expanded outward, perceiving the shadow beasts not just as physical threats, but as patterns of corrupted energy that could be unraveled if she knew where to strike. The lead shadow beast lunged without warning, moving with speed that should have been impossible for something its size. Alina did not try to dodge. She stepped forward to meet the attack, her silver blade intercepting the creature's charge and slicing clean through its corrupted form. The shadow beast dissolved into black mist that was immediately burned away by the residual light clinging to Alina's weapon. 1 down. 11 to go. The remaining shadow beasts attacked as a coordinated unit, coming at her from multiple angles simultaneously, trying to overwhelm her defenses through sheer numbers and ferocity. But Alina was no longer the frightened girl who had fled the palace. She was something else entirely now, something that moved through the battle with a grace and efficiency that came from the silver flame itself rather than any learned technique. Her blades carved through shadow flesh as if it were water. Her shield turned aside attacks that should have torn her apart. And with every creature she destroyed, she understood the darkness a little better, learned its patterns and its weaknesses and the ways it could be fought. The battle was over in minutes. 12 shadow beasts lay dissolved into mist around her, their corrupted forms unable to maintain cohesion after being cut by weapons forged from moonlight itself. Alina stood in the center of the carnage, unmarked and breathing easily, the silver light still blazing from her body like a second skin. She had won her first real battle. But even as satisfaction at the victory began to settle into her bones, she felt something else. A presence. Vast and ancient, and so utterly malevolent that it made the shadow beasts seem like harmless puppies by comparison. It was watching her from somewhere beyond the physical realm, studying her through the connection the shadow beasts had provided before their destruction, evaluating this new threat that had just announced its existence so dramatically. And then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing her ears entirely to resonate directly in her mind. It was not words so much as pure communication, concepts and intentions forced into her consciousness, with enough power that resisting them was not even an option. Child of the flame. Silver bearer. Moon's chosen weapon. I have waited so long to meet you. Your predecessors thought they had won when they sealed me away in the darkness between worlds. They thought their sacrifice would protect the realm for all eternity. But eternity's end, little flame. Seals weaken. And I am patient in ways that mortal creatures cannot comprehend. I am coming. And when I arrive, you will have a choice to make. Stand with your kind and watch them burn, or stand with me and claim power that makes your silver flame look like a candle in a hurricane. I offer you this choice because I recognize what you are, what you could become. You were shaped by suffering, forged in pain, given power that your own people fear and reject. Why would you fight for those who have shown you nothing but cruelty? Join me. Let me teach you what the silver flame can truly do when it is not constrained by the pathetic morality of creatures who fear their own potential. Together, we could remake this world into something glorious. The presence withdrew as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving Alina standing alone in the forest with the echoes of the offer ringing in her mind. She should have been terrified. She should have been running back to the palace, to Kale, to anyone who could help her understand what had just spoken to her. But instead, she felt something else entirely. Rage. Pure, incandescent fury at the audacity of the darkness, to think she could be bought with promises of power. To assume that her suffering had made her weak or vulnerable or willing to betray everything she was for the sake of revenge against those who had hurt her. The darkness did not understand her at all. Yes, she had been rejected and abused and treated as if she were cursed. Yes, her own people feared her power and would probably rather see her destroyed than accept her as their champion. Yes, she had every reason to hate them and to want to watch them suffer as she had suffered. But she was not fighting for them. She was fighting for the ones who could not fight for themselves. For the children who would grow up in a world consumed by shadow if she failed. For the innocent wolves who had never done anything to deserve the fate that awaited them if the darkness won. For her mother, who had given her life so that Alina could have the power needed to stand against this exact threat. And she was fighting for herself. For the right to exist without being defined by others' fear or hatred. For the freedom to live without constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack. For the chance to build something beautiful in a world that had shown her mostly ugliness. The silver flame roared to life in response to her determination, burning brighter and hotter than ever before, fueled not by pain or desperation, but by purpose. Alina tilted her head back and let the power flow through her completely, let it reshape her body into something that existed between mortal and divine, between wolf and weapon of the moon goddess herself. Her shift, when it came, was nothing like the transformations she had experienced before. Her wolf form erupted from her human shape in an explosion of silver light, but this was not the frightened creature she had become during her first shift in that cellar years ago. This was something magnificent, something that had never existed in the mortal realm before, something that the ancient prophecies had only been able to describe in the vaguest terms because the reality of it defied explanation. Her fur was pure white, but every strand was threaded with silver that glowed with its own inner luminescence. Her body was larger than any natural wolf, standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with muscle and bone that had been reinforced by moonlight until they were stronger than steel. Her eyes burned with violet fire that had returned now that the transformation was complete, brighter and more intense than they had ever been in her human form. And from her shoulders sprouted something that should not have been possible. Wings. Not physical appendages of flesh and feather, but structures formed entirely from silver flame, translucent and ethereal and capable of carrying her through the air as easily as her legs carried her across the ground. She was not just a wolf anymore. She was the moon's avatar, the physical manifestation of the goddess's power in the mortal realm, the weapon that had been forged over 8 years of suffering to stand against the returning darkness. Alina threw back her head and howled, and the sound that emerged was not just a wolf's cry, but something more, something that carried power and challenge and absolute defiance across the wild lands and beyond. The howl said, "I am here. I am awake. I am ready. Come for me if you dare." And in the palace miles away, every wolf who heard that impossible sound felt their blood run cold. Because they understood, in that moment, exactly what they had tried to destroy. Exactly what they had pushed away. Exactly what they were going to need if they had any hope of surviving what was coming. Kale, racing through the forest in his golden wolf form, felt the howl pierce through his soul like an arrow. The mate bond blazed between them, stronger than ever despite the physical distance, and through it he could sense what Alina had become. Magnificent. Terrifying. utterly beyond anything he had imagined even in his wildest hopes. She was not the girl who had fled the palace anymore. She was the silver bearer fully awakened, the child of the flame embracing her destiny, the weapon they needed and the mate he had claimed, and the most powerful being to walk the realm in 1,000 years. And he had doubted her. For one moment, confronted with a falsified document and a lying stepmother, he had allowed uncertainty to enter his mind. She had seen it. She had felt his hesitation through the mate bond. And it had broken something between them that he was not sure could ever be fully repaired. Cale pushed himself faster, following the silver light that blazed through the forest canopy like a beacon, desperate to reach her before she decided that she no longer needed anyone, that she could face the darkness alone. Because the truth that he had realized too late, the understanding that had come to him as he ran through the wilderness chasing after the mate he had failed, was simple and devastating. He needed her far more than she needed him. She was the weapon. He was just a king. And if he could not convince her to forgive him, to trust him again despite his moment of weakness, then the kingdom he ruled and the people he had sworn to protect were already lost. The silver light ahead grew brighter, and Cale knew he was close. Close to Alina. Close to answers. Close to either redemption or the final, irrevocable loss of the one thing that had ever made him feel complete. The hunt was ending. But the real battle was only just beginning. Cale found her standing in a clearing that had not existed before she arrived. The trees had been pushed back by the sheer force of her power, their massive trunks bent away from the center where Alina stood in her transformed wolf form, creating a perfect circle of open space beneath the full moon. The ground itself had changed, the normal forest floor replaced by something that looked almost crystalline, as if the earth had been fused into glass by heat beyond imagining. And in the center of it all stood the silver wolf. She was magnificent in a way that made Cale's breath catch despite having run for miles without pause. Her white fur seemed to capture and reflect the moonlight, making her glow as if she were carved from starlight itself. The silver threading through that white pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, creating patterns that shifted and moved across her body like living art. And the wings, those impossible structures of pure flame that spread from her shoulders, cast dancing shadows across the clearing that seemed to tell stories of battles fought and victories claimed and destinies fulfilled. She was looking at him. Those violet eyes, burning with power that went beyond anything natural or explainable, fixed on Cale's golden wolf form with an intensity that pinned him in place more effectively than any physical restraint. She was not cowering or fleeing or showing any of the fear and pain that had driven her from the palace. She was waiting, judging, deciding whether he was worthy of standing in her presence or if she should simply turn away and face the darkness alone. Cale shifted back to his human form, a deliberate choice to make himself vulnerable, to show that he was not approaching as an alpha asserting dominance, but as a man begging forgiveness from the woman who held his heart. The cool night air raised goosebumps on his bare skin, but he ignored the discomfort, all his focus fixed on the silver wolf before him. "Alina," he said, and his voice carried across the clearing with none of the commanding power it usually held. Just her name, spoken with all the desperate longing and regret and love that he had no idea how to properly express. The silver wolf did not shift back to human form. She remained as she was, massive and powerful and keeping that barrier of transformation between them, a clear statement that she was not ready to be vulnerable in his presence again. The mate bond pulsed between them, and through it Cale could feel the war raging inside her. The part of her that wanted to forgive him, that recognized the bond they shared and ached to close the distance and accept his apology. And the part of her that had been hurt too many times, that could not afford to trust again only to be betrayed when the next crisis arrived. He had to choose his words carefully. One wrong phrase, one hint of the doubt that had plagued him in the council chamber, and he would lose her forever. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. In the council chamber, when Vivian presented that document, I should have rejected it immediately. I should have defended you without hesitation. I should have trusted what I know to be true about you rather than allowing even a moment of uncertainty to enter my mind. The silver wolf's ears twitched, the only indication that she was listening. Cale continued, forcing himself to be honest in ways he had never been with anyone before. I have spent my entire life being taught to question everything, to trust no one completely, to always look for the hidden threat or the concealed betrayal. My father raised me to believe that hesitation was wisdom and that faith in others was the weakness that would get me killed. He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. So when that document was presented, when Vivian claimed to have proof that you had killed your mother, my training took over. For one moment, just one terrible moment, I forgot that you are not my enemy. I forgot that the mate bond does not lie. I forgot everything except the voice in my head that my father spent decades drilling into me, the voice that says trust no one and question everything and never let emotion override logic. The silver wolf took a step forward, and Cale felt hope flare in his chest. But that is not an excuse, he said quickly, not allowing himself to believe he was forgiven yet. That is an explanation, but it is not an excuse. You deserved my unwavering support. You deserved to have me stand beside you without a single flicker of doubt. And I failed you. The clearing was silent except for the whisper of wind through the bent trees and the distant sounds of the forest going about its nocturnal business. Cale stood before the silver wolf, naked in every sense of the word, offering no defense and expecting no mercy. If you choose to reject me, he said softly, if you decide that my moment of weakness has broken the trust between us beyond repair, I will accept that decision. I will not fight you. I will not try to claim you against your will. The mate bond is sacred, but it is not a chain. You are free to choose. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to say the words that terrified him more than any battle or political crisis ever had. But know this, Alina. Whether you forgive me or not, whether you choose to stand beside me or walk away, I will spend the rest of my life regretting that moment of doubt. Because in that instant, I hurt the one person in this world who has ever made me feel like I am more than just the role I was born to fill. You make me want to be better. You make me believe that there is more to life than duty and sacrifice and the endless weight of responsibility. You make me feel like a person rather than a weapon shaped by a cruel father and forged in battles I never wanted to fight. And I love you. The words hung in the air between them, and Cale realized with a jolt that he had never said them before. Not during their intimate dinners or their kiss beneath the moon or any of the moments they had shared. He had thought the mate bond made the words unnecessary, that she would simply know what he felt through the connection they shared. But words mattered. Especially words that had never been spoken. I love you, he repeated, his voice stronger now, more certain. I love your strength and your courage and your refusal to be broken by people who tried to destroy you. I love the way you look at the world with hope despite having every reason to despair. I love the fire in your eyes when you are angry and the softness in your smile when you allow yourself a moment of peace. I love everything about you, Alina. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that if you give me the chance. The silver wolf shifted. The transformation back to human form was different this time, slower and more controlled, the silver light gradually condensing and reshaping until Alina stood before him on 2 legs instead of 4. But the wings remained, those impossible structures of flame spreading from her bare shoulders and casting her in a halo of radiance that made her look like something divine. She was crying. Tears streamed down her face, catching the silver light and shimmering like liquid diamonds. But she was not sobbing or breaking down. She was simply letting the emotion flow through her, accepting it as part of the truth she had learned to embrace. When she spoke, her voice was rough with tears but steady. I wanted to believe that you would never doubt me, she said. I wanted to believe that the mate bond meant you would see past every accusation and every lie and every piece of evidence that others might use against me. I wanted to believe that I had finally found someone who would stand beside me no matter what. Cale felt his heart shatter at the pain in her words. But that was not fair to you, Alina continued, and her next words surprised him completely. You are not perfect. You are not some flawless hero who never makes mistakes or has moments of weakness. You are a person, just like I am, shaped by your past and carrying scars that inform how you see the world. She stepped closer, closing some of the distance between them. I have spent my entire life being defined by other people's fears and expectations. I have been the cursed girl, the dangerous one, the monster that needed to be contained or destroyed. And in the palace, for those few precious days, I allowed myself to become something else in your eyes. Something worthy. Something loved. Another step closer. But that was putting too much pressure on you to be my savior. That was asking you to carry the weight of my self-worth on your shoulders. And that is not fair to either of us. She stood directly before him now, close enough to touch, the silver light from her wings bathing them both in radiance. I do not need you to be perfect, Cale. I do not need you to never doubt or never make mistakes. What I need is for you to be honest with me. To tell me when you are struggling instead of hiding it. To trust that I am strong enough to handle your moments of weakness, just as you handle mine. Cale reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and cupped her face in his hands. I can do that, he said quietly. I can be honest with you. I can trust you with my doubts and my fears and all the parts of myself that I have spent years hiding from everyone else. Alina leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the contact. Then we try again, she whispered. We learn from this. We become stronger because of it rather than letting it break us. She opened her eyes, and Cale saw something in their violet depths that had not been there before. A certainty. A power that went beyond the silver flame or the physical transformation she had undergone. This was Alina fully awakened, fully aware of who she was and what she was capable of. And she was choosing him anyway. The relief that flooded through Cale was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. But before he could respond, before he could pull her into his arms and show her without words how much her forgiveness meant to him, Alina stiffened. Her head turned sharply to the east, her eyes narrowing as she focused on something Cale could not yet perceive. Through the mate bond, he felt a spike of alarm that had nothing to do with their personal situation. They are coming, Alina said, her voice dropping to something that carried both warning and anticipation. The shadow beasts. More of them this time. Many more. And they are bringing something else with them. Something bigger. Cale shifted immediately, his wolf form erupting in a blur of golden light as he prepared to face whatever threat was approaching. How many? He demanded through the mental link that all wolves shared in their animal forms. Dozens, Alina responded, her own form blurring as she shifted back to the silver wolf. Maybe hundreds. They are converging on this location from multiple directions. They know where we are. They are hunting us specifically. The darkness is testing us, Cale realized with grim certainty. It saw what you became when you awakened your power. It is trying to determine how much of a threat you truly are. Alina's mental voice carried a note of dark amusement. Then let us show it exactly how much of a threat I can be. She spread her wings, and the silver flame that composed them blazed brighter, casting the entire clearing in radiance that turned night into day. The light pulsed outward in waves that Cale could feel even in his wolf form, a challenge being issued to everything that served the darkness. Come for me if you dare. I am the child of the flame. I am the moon's chosen weapon. And I will burn every shadow creature that dares to threaten what is mine. The first of the shadow beasts emerged from the forest surrounding the clearing, and Cale felt his blood run cold at the sheer number of them. Alina had been right. There were dozens visible already, with more pouring from the darkness between the trees with every passing moment. These were not the same as the ones she had fought earlier. These were larger, more heavily corrupted, their forms so twisted by the darkness that they barely resembled wolves anymore. And behind them, towering over even the largest of the shadow beasts, came something that made Kale's wolf instincts scream in terror. A Shadow Lord. The servants of the ancient darkness made manifest, creatures of pure malevolence that had not walked the mortal realm in over 1,000 years. This one stood nearly 15 feet tall, its form vaguely humanoid, but composed entirely of writhing shadows that seemed to devour the light around it. Its eyes were pits of absolute darkness, and when it opened its mouth to speak, the voice that emerged was the same one that had offered Alina a choice in the aftermath of her first battle. "Child of the Flame," the Shadow Lord said, its voice resonating across the clearing with power that made the ground tremble. "You have made your choice. You have rejected my offer. And now you will learn the price of that rejection." The shadow beasts surged forward as one, a wave of corrupted flesh and malevolent intent that sought to overwhelm through sheer numbers. But they had made a critical mistake. They had challenged Alina on ground she had already claimed, in a clearing that had been transformed by her power into something close to sacred space. And they had underestimated exactly how much she had changed since fleeing the palace. Alina did not wait for the shadow beasts to reach her. She launched herself into the air on wings of silver flame, rising above the charging horde with a grace that defied physics. And from that elevated position, she unleashed the full fury of the power she had been holding in check. Silver fire poured from her body in torrents, cascading down upon the shadow beasts like a waterfall of liquid starlight. Where it touched corrupted flesh, the creatures dissolved instantly, their forms unable to withstand contact with moonlight made manifest. The silver flame spread across the clearing in waves, burning away shadow and corruption and darkness, purifying the ground and the air and everything it touched. The shadow beasts tried to flee, tried to retreat back into the forest where the light could not reach them so easily. But Kale was waiting. His golden wolf form tore through the creatures that tried to escape, his jaws closing on shadow flesh and his claws rending corrupted forms with savage efficiency. He was not alone. Through the mate bond, he could draw on Alina's power, could channel a fraction of the silver flame through his own body to make his attacks devastating to creatures that should have been nearly immune to physical damage. Together, they were unstoppable. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Shadow beasts fell by the dozens, their numbers meaning nothing against the combined might of the Alpha King and the Silver Bearer fighting as a perfectly coordinated unit. They moved around each other with an ease that spoke of the mate bond guiding their actions, anticipating each other's moves, covering weaknesses and amplifying strengths. But the Shadow Lord did not join the battle. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with those terrible empty eyes, evaluating and learning and preparing for the next encounter. Because this was just a test, Kale realized with growing dread. This was not a serious attempt to kill them. This was the darkness gathering information, measuring their capabilities, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited in future battles. And when the last of the shadow beasts had been destroyed, when the clearing was littered with dissolving corpses and the air reeked of burned corruption, the Shadow Lord finally spoke again. Impressive, it said, its voice carrying something that might have been approval. You are stronger than your predecessors. More skilled. More willing to embrace the full extent of your power without the moral hesitation that crippled those who came before you. The Shadow Lord began to fade, its form dissolving back into the darkness from which it had emerged. But its final words echoed across the clearing with the weight of absolute certainty. I look forward to our next meeting, Child of the Flame. And when that day comes, when the full might of the returning darkness stands arrayed against you, we will see if your pretty fire is enough to hold back the tide. Because make no mistake, we are coming. The seals are breaking. And when we arrive in full force, we will consume this world and everything in it. Unless you can stop us. The Shadow Lord vanished completely, leaving behind only the residual chill of its presence and the terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. Alina landed beside Kale, her wings folding against her back as she shifted into human form once more. She was breathing hard, exhausted by the expenditure of power, but her eyes were bright with a fierce joy that had nothing to do with the battle just won and everything to do with what she had proven. She was strong enough, fast enough, powerful enough. She could face the darkness and win. But the victory was hollow, because both she and Kale understood what the Shadow Lord's appearance truly meant. The war had begun. Not some distant future threat that they would have years to prepare for, but an immediate crisis that was unfolding right now, in this moment, across the entire realm. The darkness was testing defenses, probing for weaknesses, gathering information about the forces arrayed against it. And when it had learned what it needed to learn, it would strike with everything it had. Kale shifted back to human form and pulled Alina into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as if he could protect her from what was coming through sheer force of will. She melted into his embrace, her exhaustion finally catching up with her, her body trembling with the aftereffects of channeling so much power. "We need to go back," Kale said quietly. "We need to warn the council. We need to prepare the packs for what is coming." Alina pulled back slightly to look up at him, and in her eyes he saw not fear but determination. "They will not want to believe us," she said. "They will think we are exaggerating or trying to manipulate them. They will waste precious time debating and arguing and trying to find political solutions to a threat that cannot be reasoned with." "Then we make them believe," Kale responded firmly. "We show them what we face tonight. We force them to acknowledge that the ancient enemy is no longer ancient history but immediate danger. And if they still refuse to listen, if they choose political games over survival, then we find those who are willing to fight and we prepare them ourselves." Alina studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she seemed to find, because she finally nodded. "Together," she said. "We do this together. No more hesitation. No more doubt. We are bound by more than the mate bond now. We are bound by purpose." Together, Kale agreed, and he sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of silver light and golden fire and the absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The moon hung full and bright above them, bathing the clearing in light that seemed almost approving, as if the goddess herself was watching and pleased with what her chosen champions had become. But even that divine radiance could not completely dispel the shadows gathering on the horizon. The darkness was coming, and the question that would determine the fate of every wolf in the realm, every innocent life that had no idea what was approaching, every child who deserved to grow up in a world not consumed by shadow, was simple. Would Alina and Kale be enough? Would the Silver Bearer and the Alpha King, bound by fate and love and shared purpose, be able to stand against a force that had destroyed civilizations in ages past? Would the light be strong enough to hold back the darkness? Or would this world, like so many others before it, fall into shadow and silence and the absolute certainty that hope was nothing but a beautiful lie told to creatures too naive to understand that darkness always wins in the end? The answer remained unwritten, waiting to be determined by choices not yet made and battles not yet fought and sacrifices that neither Alina nor Kale could fully anticipate. But one thing was certain. They would fight. They would stand together against the returning darkness, even if standing meant dying, even if fighting meant sacrificing everything they had only just found. Because some things were worth dying for. And some lights were bright enough to illuminate the darkness, even after they had been extinguished. So here is the question that echoes across the wild lands tonight, the question that whispers through the palace halls and trembles on the lips of every wolf who witnessed the silver light blazing against the shadow. Would you have chosen her side? Would you have stood with Alina when her own people called her cursed and dangerous and too powerful to be trusted? Would you have believed in her when even her mate hesitated, when the evidence seemed overwhelming, when choosing her meant risking everything you thought you knew about safety and order and the way the world is supposed to work? Or would you have been one of the voices calling for her destruction, one of the wolves convinced that power like hers could only bring ruin, one of the countless souls who chose fear over faith and condemnation over compassion? It is easy to say you would have chosen differently. It is easy to believe that you would have seen past the accusations and the manipulations and the carefully constructed lies designed to make her seem like a threat. But Alina's story asks us to consider something harder. What if the hero does not look like a hero? What if the weapon forged to save the world is carried by someone broken and scarred and so thoroughly convinced of their own worthlessness that they can barely stand upright under the weight of it? What if salvation comes wrapped in silver light and violet eyes and a power so vast that embracing it means accepting that everything you thought you knew about the nature of good and evil was incomplete? Would you still choose her side? Or would you let fear win? The darkness is counting on fear. It is counting on wolves like Cassandra and Vivian, on council members who prioritize control over courage, on ordinary people who would rather destroy what they do not understand than risk the discomfort of changing their minds. It is counting on the fact that most of us, when faced with something that challenges our understanding of the world, will choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. But there are always a few who choose differently. A few who look at the cursed girl standing alone against the shadows and decide that maybe, just maybe, the curse is actually a blessing in disguise. A few who see past the surface to the soul beneath, who recognize strength in places others see only weakness, who understand that the brightest lights often come from the darkest places. A few who choose to stand beside the silver bearer even when standing means becoming a target themselves. Are you one of those few? Would you have draped your cloak over her shoulders when the world was tearing her dress to shreds? Would you have spoken her name with reverence when others spat it like a curse? Would you have chosen love over fear, faith over doubt, hope over the comfortable certainty that some people are simply too broken to be saved? The story of Alina and Kale is not finished. The war against the darkness is only beginning. There are battles yet to be fought and sacrifices yet to be made and moments of triumph and despair that will test everything they believe about themselves and each other. But the most important question has already been answered. They chose each other. Despite doubt and betrayal and every reason to walk away, they chose to stand together against what is coming. And that choice, that simple decision to believe in something larger than fear, might just be enough to tip the balance. Because darkness, for all its power and all its terrible certainty, has one critical weakness. It cannot create. It can only consume what others have built, can only corrupt what others have made beautiful, can only destroy what others have dared to love. But love creates. Hope builds. And the silver flame, when wielded by someone who has survived the fire and emerged stronger, can illuminate even the deepest darkness. So if this story has wrapped itself around your heart, if you find yourself desperate to know what happens when the darkness arrives in full force, if you need to see whether Alina and Kale's love is strong enough to survive the trials ahead, then you belong here. You belong in this pack of readers who understand that the best stories are the ones that challenge us, that make us question what we think we know, that force us to examine our own hearts and ask if we would have the courage to choose differently when fear is screaming at us to run. Subscribe to Cynthia's Shifter Romance. Turn on that notification bell. Because this story is far from over. The silver flame is just beginning to burn. And the darkness has no idea what is waiting for it when Alina finally stops holding back and embraces the full extent of her power. The hunt continues. The war escalates. And the girl they tried to break is about to show them exactly what happens when you forge a weapon in the fires of suffering and then give it a reason to fight. Welcome to the pack. Welcome to Stories That Burn. Welcome to the beginning of something that will change everything. The moon is rising. The silver flame is calling. And the darkness is about to learn that some lights refuse to be extinguished.